Tonight, we journey back through time to an era of salt spray and canvas sails, to a chapter of history that has been whispered about in hushed tones, but rarely told in full. This is the story of the Jewish pirates of the Caribbean, men and women who fled persecution only to find freedom on the endless blue horizon. There is no need to remember every detail, no test to pass. Simply let these tales wash over you, carrying away the concerns of your day. To understand why Jews became pirates, we must first understand what they were fleeing. Picture, if you will, the Iberian Peninsula in the late 15th century. Spain and Portugal, newly unified Christian kingdoms, were consolidating their power. The year is 1492, and while Christopher Columbus is preparing to sail west, something far more sinister is unfolding on land. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, had grown into a machinery of fear. Its original purpose was to root out false converts to Christianity, those who secretly maintained Jewish practices. But like many instruments of persecution, it grew beyond its stated purpose, becoming a tool of political control, economic confiscation, and social terror. The methods employed by the Inquisition were designed to break both body and spirit. Suspected Judaizantes, as they were called, faced interrogation chambers where the promise of pain was often as effective as pain itself. The strapado, the rack, the water torture, these were not merely threats, but realities that destroyed countless lives. But perhaps even more terrifying than the physical torture was the psychological warfare. The Inquisition relied on informants, on neighbors denouncing neighbors, on children testifying against parents. Trust itself became impossible. A family that lit candles on Friday night, that refused to eat pork, that washed their dead before burial. Any of these observances could lead to denunciation, arrest, and trial. The trials themselves were grotesque parodies of justice. The accused were not told the charges against them or the names of their accusers. They were pressured to confess to crimes they often had not committed, told that confession was the only path to mercy. And even if they confessed, even if they named others in desperate attempts to save themselves, mercy was rarely granted. The ultimate punishment was the auto da fe, the act of faith. These were public spectacles, carefully orchestrated displays of the Inquisition's power. In city squares packed with crowds, those convicted of heresy were led out in penitential garments called sanbenitos. Some had already been strangled in their cells, a mercy of sorts. Others were burned alive while crowds watched and priests prayed for their souls. In that same year of 1492, the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella issued the Alhambra Decree. It gave the Jews of Spain a stark choice: convert to Christianity or leave the kingdom within 4 months. No middle ground existed. Families who had lived in Iberia for centuries, who had built communities and businesses, who had contributed to the cultural flowering of medieval Spain during the Convivencia, the period of relative coexistence between Christians, Muslims, and Jews. All of this history meant nothing. They had 4 months. The practical challenges of this expulsion were staggering. Jews were forbidden from taking gold, silver, or coined money out of the country. They could take only what they could carry of their household goods. Properties had to be sold quickly, which meant they sold for a fraction of their value. Christians who had been neighbors for decades suddenly became opportunistic buyers, acquiring houses and businesses for pennies on the pound. Between 100 and 200,000 Jews fled. The exact number is impossible to determine. Some converted at the last moment, becoming conversos, new Christians who lived under constant suspicion. Others tried to flee but were caught at the borders, their possessions confiscated, sometimes their children taken and forcibly baptized. Those who successfully left faced perilous journeys. Ships were overcrowded and unsanitary. Captains sometimes abandoned their passengers on deserted coasts or sold them into slavery. Pirates attacked the refugee ships, knowing they carried desperate people with whatever portable wealth they had managed to hide. Disease swept through the crowded holds. Many died before reaching any safe harbor. Some went to Portugal hoping that their ancient communities there would provide refuge, but that hope was cruelly dashed. In 1497, King Manuel I of Portugal, seeking to marry Isabella of Aragon, agreed to expel the Jews as a condition of the marriage. However, Manuel took a different approach. Rather than allow them to leave, he ordered mass forced conversions. Jews were dragged to baptismal fonts. Parents watched helplessly as their children were torn from their arms and baptized. The trauma of this moment would echo through generations. Others traveled to the Ottoman Empire, where Sultan Bayezid II welcomed them, reportedly saying, "You venture to call Ferdinand a wise ruler, he who has impoverished his own country and enriched mine." The Sultan understood what Spain had lost: skilled artisans, physicians, merchants, and scholars. Cities like Salonika, Constantinople, and Saft developed thriving Sephardic communities that preserved Ladino, the Judeo-Spanish language, and maintained Iberian customs for centuries. Still others went to North Africa, to Morocco and Tunisia, where established Jewish communities absorbed the refugees, though not always harmoniously. The newcomers, educated and often worldly, sometimes clashed with the local populations who had different customs and traditions, but they adapted as Jews had always adapted, and some looked westward to the vast unknown territories across the Atlantic. The New World, as it was being called, represented possibility. True, Spain claimed dominion over these lands, but the ocean was vast and Spanish control was tenuous. Islands dotted the Caribbean like emeralds scattered across blue silk. Perhaps there, far from the reaches of the Inquisition, a new life could be built. These Sephardic Jews, as they came to be known from the Hebrew word for Spain, Sepharad, carried with them more than possessions. They carried languages, Ladino, Hebrew, and often fluency in Spanish, Portuguese, and Arabic. They carried maritime skills, knowledge of navigation and trade winds, and the stars that guided ships across dark waters. They carried trading networks, connections to family members, and coreligionists scattered across the Mediterranean and Atlantic worlds. And they carried something else, something harder to quantify but no less real, a burning desire never to be powerless again, the humiliation of expulsion, the horror of seeing loved ones tortured or burned, the impotence of standing by while everything was taken. These experiences forged a determination that mere survival was not enough. Freedom, real freedom, meant the power to defend oneself, to strike back at enemies, to never again depend on the mercy of others. Let this image rest in your mind. Families boarding ships with whatever possessions they could carry, sailing toward an uncertain future, the coastline of their homeland disappearing into mist. Children crying, not understanding why they must leave. Parents stone-faced, not allowing themselves to feel the grief because feeling it would make moving forward impossible. Elderly grandparents taking one last look at the land where their ancestors were buried, knowing they would die in exile, that their bones would rest in foreign soil. The ships creak and sway. The horizon is empty of everything except water and sky. Behind them is loss. Ahead is only uncertainty. But the ships sail on, because there is no choice but to sail on, because stopping means death, and sailing means at least the possibility of life. The Caribbean in the early 1600s was a place of chaos and possibility in equal measure. The Spanish claimed dominion over vast territories stretching from Florida to the northern coast of South America, encompassing islands large and small. But claiming territory and controlling it were two different things. Spain's empire was overstretched, its resources committed to wars in Europe, its bureaucracy slow and commipped. Into this power vacuum came other European nations, all eager for a share of New World wealth. The English, the French, the Dutch, even the Danes, all established footholds in the Caribbean. They claimed islands Spain had ignored, built fortifications on strategically located coasts, and encouraged a culture of piracy and privateering that would torment Spanish shipping for 2 centuries. The islands themselves were scattered like emeralds across turquoise waters. Jamaica, Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, the Greater Antilles, large and mountainous. Then the Lesser Antilles, a chain of smaller islands curving south and east, Barbados, Martinique, Guadeloupe, St. Kitts, Antigua, and the smaller still, Curaçao, Aruba, Bonaire, the ABC Islands off the Venezuelan coast. Each had its own character, its own combination of harbors and resources and dangers. The climate was both blessing and curse. The warmth made it possible to grow sugarcane, tobacco, and indig crops that would generate enormous wealth. But the heat also bred disease. Yellow fever, malaria, dysentery. These killed newcomers with horrifying regularity. The Caribbean was known as a death trap for Europeans. Entire expeditions would arrive only to see half their number dead within a year. Hurricanes swept through seasonally, destroying ships, flattening settlements, drowning hundreds. The hurricane season ran from June through November, and during those months, wise sailors stayed in port or sought calmer waters. Those caught at sea when a hurricane struck rarely survived. The ocean that offered freedom could also become a killer without warning. Into this world came the Sephardic refugees and their descendants. Many settled initially as merchants, establishing themselves in the few places that offered religious tolerance. The Dutch colonies were the most welcoming. The Netherlands itself had become a refuge for Jews fleeing Iberia, and the Dutch carried this relative tolerance to their Caribbean possessions. Amsterdam had become a center of Sephardic Jewish life by the early 1600s. Portuguese and Spanish Jews had fled there, establishing a vibrant community. They built magnificent synagogues, published books in Hebrew and Ladino, and created charitable institutions to help new refugees. Many became wealthy in international trade, particularly the sugar and diamond trades. When the Dutch established the West India Company in 1621, Sephardic merchants were among its investors and supporters. The West India Company was not simply a trading concern, but an instrument of warfare through commerce. It was chartered specifically to attack Spanish and Portuguese interests in the Atlantic and Caribbean. This made it a natural ally for Sephardic Jews who had their own reasons to oppose Iberian power. The company offered letters of marque, licenses to attack enemy shipping, blurring the line between legitimate warfare and piracy. Curaçao became perhaps the most important Sephardic center in the Caribbean. The Dutch captured it from Spain in 1634, and Jews began arriving soon after. By 1651, the Jewish community had grown substantial enough to build the Mikveh Israel Emmanuel Synagogue, which still stands today, making it the oldest continuously used synagogue in the Americas. The synagogue itself tells a story. Its floor is covered in sand, a tradition with multiple meanings. Some say it commemorates the exodus from Egypt, when the Israelites wandered in the desert for 40 years. Others say it represents the sand scattered on the floors of secret synagogues during the Inquisition to muffle the sound of worshippers' footsteps. Still others note the practical purpose. Sand absorbs sound in the tropical heat, where wooden floors would creak and announce movements. Perhaps it means all of these things simultaneously, layers of meaning built up over centuries of exile and adaptation. Imagine standing on the dock at Willemstad, the capital of Curaçao, in the year 1660. The sun is setting, painting the pastel buildings in shades of gold and rose. The architecture is distinctly Dutch, tall, narrow buildings with stepped gables, but adapted to the tropics with wide verandas and shuttered windows to catch the breeze. The harbour is full of ships, Dutch merchantmen, English privateers, Spanish coastal traders, vessels of uncertain allegiance flying whatever flag was convenient. You hear a babble of languages. Portuguese, the language many Sephardic Jews spoke among themselves. Dutch, the language of colonial administration. Spanish, still widely spoken despite Spanish rule having ended. English, increasingly important as English power in the Caribbean grew. Papiamento, a Creole language emerging from the mix of European and African tongues. Hebrew, drifting from the synagogue where evening prayers are being said. The air smells of salt and fish, of tobacco and rum, of the spices being unloaded from a merchant ship. It smells of sweat and unwashed bodies, for in this era before modern hygiene, cities had a pungent odor that modern people would find overwhelming. It smells of cooking fires and the distinctive sweet rotten smell of the tropics, where things grow and decay at accelerated rates. Merchants move through the streets, heading to their warehouses to check on goods, to their counting houses to review accounts, to taverns to make deals and gather intelligence. A Jewish merchant in a long coat, despite the heat, because European dress is a marker of respectability and civilization. An African stevedore, enslaved or possibly free, carrying a barrel on his shoulder. A Dutch official in colonial whites. A sailor, skin darkened by sun and salt, walking with the distinctive rolling gait of someone more comfortable on a deck than on land. This is a place where a Jewish merchant could trade by day and observe Shabbat by night without fear, where synagogues could be built openly and Jewish courts could adjudicate disputes according to Halasha, Jewish law, where children could be raised knowing they were Jews, not having to hide or pretend or live in terror of discovery. But it was also a place where, if a Spanish treasure fleet appeared on the horizon, that same merchant might become something else entirely, where the line between legitimate business and illegal piracy was as fluid as the ocean itself, where a man could be a respectable trader on Monday and a privateer by Wednesday, and no one thought this particularly strange or contradictory. The legal framework of the era made this possible. During wartime, governments issued letters of marque and reprisal, essentially licenses to attack enemy shipping. A privateer with a letter of marque was legally entitled to capture enemy vessels and claim them as prizes. The profits would be divided according to complex formulas: a share to the crown, a share to the ship owners, shares to the captain and crew according to rank. This system,
allowed governments to wage naval warfare on the cheap. Rather than maintaining large expensive fleets, they could unleash swarms of privateers who would attack enemy commerce at no cost to the treasury. The privateers bore all the risk and reaped the rewards. If they succeeded, they became wealthy. If they failed, they died or were captured. But that was their problem, not the government's. Of course, the line between privateering and piracy was often theoretical. A letter of marque was only valid against the specific enemy named in it, and only during wartime. But in the Caribbean, with communications slow and uncertain, how was a ship's captain to know if his nation was currently at war? And if a Spanish ship crossed his path, heavy with silver, was he really expected to let it pass just because peace might have been declared 3 months ago in Europe? Moreover, privateers often stretched their licenses. A letter of marque against Spain might be interpreted to justify attacking Portuguese ships, since Portugal had been under Spanish rule, and the distinction was murky. Or a privateer might attack a ship of his own nation if it was carrying goods from enemy territory, or might attack anyone if he was confident he could sell the prize before word got out and avoid any consequences. For Sephardic Jews, privateering offered something beyond profit. It offered agency. For centuries, Jews in Christian Europe had been forbidden from most professions. They could not own land, could not join guilds, could not hold public office. They were confined to certain trades, money lending, peddling, small-scale commerce. They were constantly at the mercy of rulers who might protect them or persecute them on a whim. But on a ship, none of that mattered. A crew needed sailors who could work the rigging, gunners who could aim cannons, navigators who could read the stars. If you had those skills, your religion was irrelevant. Pirate crews were remarkably democratic in some ways. They elected their captains and quartermasters. They drew up articles, essentially contracts, that specified how prizes would be divided and what compensation would be paid for injuries. A man who lost a leg in battle might receive 600 pieces of 8, a standardized rate across many pirate crews.
This was a culture where competence and courage mattered more than lineage or faith, where a Jew could prove himself as a fighting man, could earn respect through action rather than begging for tolerance, where the sword at his hip meant he was no longer helpless, no longer dependent on the whims of others. Among the Jewish pirates and privateers who sailed these waters, few names resonate as powerfully as Moses Cohen Henriques. His story, though fragmented by time and deliberately obscure sources, reveals the complex motivations that drove these men. He was not simply a criminal seeking easy wealth, though he certainly acquired wealth. He was not merely an opportunist taking advantage of chaotic times, though he certainly did that too. He was a man shaped by history, by trauma, by a deep desire to strike back at the forces that had destroyed his community. Moses Cohen Henriques was born around the turn of the 17th century, most likely in Amsterdam or possibly in Brazil, where the Dutch had established a colony that briefly flourished. His exact birth date is unknown. Record-keeping for common people was spotty in that era, and Jews often had reason to avoid official registries. But we can piece together a general picture from scattered documents and mentions in the records of his enemies. He was of Portuguese Jewish descent, his family part of the wave of refugees who had fled the Inquisition. The name Cohen suggests descent from the priestly class, though by the 17th century this was often more a matter of family tradition than religious function. The name Henriques marks Portuguese origins. Many Sephardic Jews in the Netherlands and its colonies carried Portuguese names, maintaining linguistic links to the homeland that had expelled them. Young Moses would have grown up hearing stories of family members who had been arrested by the Inquisition, stories of wealth confiscated, of synagogues burned, of forced conversions and secret Judaism maintained at terrible risk. These stories were not ancient history, but recent trauma. The people who had lived through the expulsion were still alive, old men and women who remembered Spain and Portugal before they became synonymous with danger. In Amsterdam's Sephardic community, these stories created a particular psychology. Unlike the Ashkenazi Jews of Central and Eastern Europe, who had experienced persecution as a constant low-level reality, the Sephardic Jews had experienced catastrophic loss within living memory. They had fallen from high positions. Many had been wealthy, educated, integrated into Iberian society. The expulsion was not just a loss of home, but a loss of status, of self-image, of the belief that merit and wealth could provide security. This created in many of them not resignation, but rage. A determination that never again would they be passive victims, never again would they beg for protection, never again would they depend on the goodwill of Christian rulers. They would seize power where they could find it, would fight their enemies with whatever weapons came to hand. For Moses Cohen Henriques, the weapon was the sea. By his 20s, he had become involved with the Dutch West India Company, that curious hybrid of commercial enterprise and military force. The company was always short of experienced sailors and officers, and it asked few questions about a man's background if he could handle a ship and fight. Henriques rose through the ranks quickly. He had the education common among Sephardic Jews. He could read and write in multiple languages, could calculate navigation using mathematics, understood the basics of astronomy needed for celestial navigation. He also proved capable in combat, cool-headed when cannons roared and men screamed. These qualities made him valuable. But Henriques was more than just another company officer. He had language skills that were particularly valuable in Caribbean operations. He spoke Portuguese fluently, Spanish nearly as well, Dutch competently, and presumably Hebrew, and perhaps some Ladino. This made him an ideal interrogator of captured Spanish prisoners and an excellent spy who could pass as Spanish or Portuguese when necessary. The Spanish referred to privateers and pirates of all nations as corsarios, corsairs, saying the word with contempt mixed with fear. In their reports and letters, Spanish colonial officials expressed particular fury at the Portuguese corsairs, a term that sometimes meant actual Portuguese but often was code for Sephardic Jews. The Spanish understood that some of these raiders were not merely seeking profit, but settling old scores. By 1628, Henriques had achieved enough prominence to participate in one of the most audacious naval operations in Caribbean history. Admiral Piet Pieterzoon Hein, a legendary Dutch naval commander who had himself been captured by the Spanish and forced to serve as a galley slave before escaping, was planning to intercept the Spanish treasure fleet. By 1628, Henriques had achieved enough prominence to participate in one of the most audacious naval operations in Caribbean history. Admiral Piet Pieterzoon Hein, a legendary Dutch naval commander who had himself been captured by the Spanish and forced to serve as a galley slave before escaping, was planning to intercept the Spanish treasure fleet. The Spanish treasure fleet, or flota, was the lifeline of the Spanish Empire. Every year, ships gathered at Havana, collecting the silver mined in Mexico and Peru, along with other valuable goods, pearls, emeralds, dyestuffs, sugar. They would sail together in a convoy for protection, following established routes back to Spain. The wealth they carried was staggering, the accumulated production of a year's exploitation of the Americas. Hein gathered a fleet of 31 ships and thousands of men. The operation required perfect timing. The Dutch fleet had to arrive at just the right moment to catch the Spanish convoy before it could escape into the open Atlantic, where the vastness of the ocean would make interception impossible. Intelligence was crucial. Someone had to know when the Spanish fleet would sail, what route it would take, how many warships would escort it. Henriques played a key role in planning and intelligence. His knowledge of Spanish and Portuguese, his understanding of how Spanish colonial officials thought and operated, made him invaluable. When captured Spanish sailors were interrogated, he conducted the questioning, extracting information about the fleet's composition and schedule. In September 1628, off the coast of Cuba near Matanzas Bay, the Dutch fleet found what it was seeking. The Spanish convoy appeared on the horizon, 12 ships heavy with cargo, sailing in formation with their armed escorts. When the lookouts spotted the Dutch fleet, panic erupted. The Spanish tried to flee into the shallow bay, hoping the Dutch ships with their deeper drafts could not follow. But the Dutch pursued relentlessly. Spanish ships ran aground in their haste. Others tried to land their cargoes and escape overland. The Dutch attacked with disciplined ferocity, their superior gunnery and seamanship decisive. Within hours, the entire Spanish fleet was captured or destroyed. Not a single treasure ship escaped. The haul was beyond anyone's wildest expectations. 15 metric tons of silver, chests of pearls from Venezuelan oyster beds, logwood and dye stuffs, sugar and tobacco, spices from the Orient that had been transshipped through Acapulco. The total value was estimated at 11 to 15 million guilders, equivalent to roughly 1.5 times the Dutch Republic's entire annual budget. When news reached Amsterdam, the city erupted in celebration. Church bells rang, people poured into the streets, the stock of the West India Company soared. For once, the company that had hemorrhaged money since its founding turned a massive profit. Investors who had despaired of ever seeing returns suddenly found themselves wealthy. For Moses Cohen Henriques, standing on the deck of his ship as Spanish captains surrendered their swords, this was more than a military victory or financial windfall. This was revenge served cold and calculated. The silver that would have funded Spanish military campaigns, that would have paid for inquisitors and soldiers and the apparatus of persecution, now filled Dutch coffers instead. The empire that had expelled and murdered his people was weakened. The king who had claimed divine right to rule over Jews and dictate their faith was humiliated. According to some accounts, Henriques used his portion of the prize money, which would have been substantial given his rank, to help establish Jewish communities in the Caribbean. Whether this is literally true is hard to verify, but it fits the pattern. Many Sephardic Jews who acquired wealth used it to support their co-religionists, to build synagogues and schools, to provide for refugees still fleeing persecution. Picture Henriques in that moment of triumph. The sun reflects off the water in brilliant shards of light. The Spanish captains, men who would have burned Jews without a second thought, bow before him. He speaks to them in flawless Spanish, the language of his ancestors' persecutors, accepting their surrender with formal courtesy that barely masks satisfaction. His clothes are practical, no fancy uniforms, just the sturdy breeches and shirt of a working sailor, though of good quality fabric. He wears a sword at his hip, a pistol thrust through his belt. His skin is dark from sun and salt. His hands are scarred from rope work and fighting. He looks like what he is, a man who belongs to the sea, who has found freedom on the water that the land denied him. Around him, His crew works efficiently to secure the captured ships. There is loot to be inventoried, prisoners to be secured, damage to be repaired. The work of piracy is not all fighting and glory. It is mostly tedious labor, the endless tasks required to keep ships afloat and crews alive. But in this moment, there is satisfaction. Not joy exactly, for Henriques was by all accounts a serious man, not given to displays of emotion, but satisfaction, a sense that the universe, so often unjust, has for once delivered something approximating justice, that those who do evil have been made to suffer loss, that victims can become victors. The Spanish would call this piracy banditry, theft. They would denounce Henriques as a criminal and a heretic. Their reports and letters would seethe with rage at the Portuguese corsair who had humiliated their empire. But Henriques would not have cared what they called him. He had struck back. He had proven that Jews were not helpless. He had shown that enemies of his people could be made to feel fear. This psychological dimension, the reclamation of agency, the refusal to be defined solely as victims, this mattered as much as the silver, perhaps more. Silver could be spent, would eventually be gone, but the memory of striking back, that would endure. That would be told and retold in Sephardic communities, would become part of the collective story of survival and resistance. Let this image settle in your mind and then fade, like a dream dissolving into morning mist. Your breathing is slow, your body is heavy. The story continues, but you are drifting, suspended between waking and sleep, held safely by these tales of long ago. Moses Cohen Henriques was far from alone. The Caribbean harbored an entire community of Jewish sailors and merchants who operated in the grey areas between legitimate trade, privateering, and outright piracy. Their motivations varied. Some sought revenge against Spain, others profit, many both. But they formed networks of mutual support, channels through which information, goods, and assistance flowed. The names that survive in historical records are fragmentary and scattered. David Abrabanel, who sailed with the infamous privateer Henry Morgan during his raids against Spanish settlements. Yakov Coriel, who operated out of Dutch Brazil before it fell back under Portuguese control. Samuel Palache, a fascinating figure who served as both a diplomatic envoy for Morocco and a corsair captain, raiding Spanish shipping while negotiating treaties with European powers. These men existed in multiple worlds simultaneously, sliding between identities as circumstances required. A respectable merchant in port could become a feared raider at sea. A diplomatic negotiator could also be a ship's captain. The boundaries that modern people assume between different roles were far more fluid in the 17th century Caribbean. Consider the case of Samuel Palache more closely, for his story illustrates the complexity of these figures. Born in Morocco to a family that had fled Spain during the expulsion, Palache grew up in Fez, where he learned Arabic, Hebrew, Spanish, and Portuguese. He became a merchant, trading across the Mediterranean, building relationships with Dutch traders who frequented Moroccan ports. In the early 1600s, the Sultan of Morocco appointed him as an envoy to the Dutch Republic. His mission was to negotiate a military alliance against Spain, Morocco's enemy to the north. Palache traveled to Amsterdam, where he was received with honor. The Dutch were always happy to make common cause with Spain's enemies. Palache negotiated a treaty and established himself in Amsterdam, where he connected with the city's growing Sephardic community. But Palache did not remain in Amsterdam making diplomatic arrangements. He outfitted ships for privateering, obtained letters of marque from the Dutch government, and personally led raids against Spanish shipping. In 1614, he captured 2 Spanish merchant vessels off the coast of Portugal, bringing them back to the Netherlands as prizes. The Spanish were furious. They protested that a diplomatic envoy engaging in piracy was a violation of international law and civilized norms. The Dutch response was essentially that Palaci's diplomatic status and his activities as a privateer were separate matters. As an envoy, he was protected by diplomatic immunity. As a ship's captain with a valid letter of marque, he was entitled to attack Spanish vessels. The Spanish found this argument infuriating, but legally difficult to counter. Palace died in 1616 in the Netherlands and was buried with honors in the Sephardic cemetery in Ouderkerk, his tombstone identifying him as an ambassador. But in Spain, he was remembered as a pirate and a heretic, a Jew who had audaciously attacked Spanish ships while claiming diplomatic protection. His story was not unique. Throughout the Caribbean, Jewish merchants maintained similar dual or triple identities. By day, they ran shops and warehouses in Port Royal, Curaçao, or Bridgetown. They kept accounts, haggled over prices, extended credit, and foreclosed on debts. They dressed respectably, attended synagogue services, circumcised their sons, and married off their daughters with appropriate dowries. But they also maintained ties to the privateering world. They provided intelligence about Spanish shipping routes and schedules. They purchased captured goods, asking few questions about provenance. They extended credit to privateering expeditions, taking a share of profits in return. They converted stolen Spanish silver into Amsterdam banknotes. They were integral to the ecosystem that made Caribbean piracy economically viable. The relationship between Jewish pirates and other Caribbean buccaneers was complex and multifaceted. On one hand, the freewheeling pirate culture of the era was remarkably egalitarian in some respects. Pirate ships operated according to articles, essentially contracts that spelled out how prizes would be divided, how the ship would be governed, and what rights crew members possessed. These articles were surprisingly democratic. Captains could be voted out if the crew lost confidence in them. Major decisions were often made collectively, and shares of plunder were distributed according to relatively egalitarian formulas. In this environment, a man's skill with a cutlass or his ability to navigate by the stars mattered more than his religion or nationality. Crews were wildly diverse: English, French, Dutch, Portuguese, Spanish, African, indigenous Caribbean. A Jewish sailor who could pull his weight and fight when necessary could find acceptance among pirates in a way that would have been impossible in most European societies of the era. Contemporary accounts make clear that religion was not a barrier to piracy. A Spanish friar who had been captured by pirates wrote with outrage that the pirate crew included Englishmen, Frenchmen, Dutchmen, Portuguese, a Moor, and worst of all, a Jew who had the audacity to speak to me in Spanish about the Torah. The friar's horror reveals the reality. Pirate crews included Jews, and this was accepted as part of the diverse nature of these floating communities. However, acceptance was not the same as full equality or the absence of prejudice. Anti-Jewish sentiment was deeply ingrained in European culture, and pirates, for all their rejection of other social norms, were still products of that culture. Jewish pirates often had to prove themselves more thoroughly than their Christian counterparts. They had to be more daring, more successful, to earn the same level of respect. There are accounts of Jewish sailors facing mockery or suspicion from crewmates. Their refusal to work on the Sabbath could cause friction, though pirate articles often made allowances for religious observance. Their dietary restrictions, kashrut, the Jewish dietary laws, required accommodation that not all captains were willing to provide. A Jewish pirate who wanted to maintain religious practice had to navigate these challenges carefully. This is why Jewish sailors often preferred to sail together when possible, forming their own crews where they could observe their traditions without interference. A ship with a Jewish captain and a predominantly Jewish crew could maintain kosher practices, observe the Sabbath, and celebrate Jewish holidays without having to constantly explain or defend these choices. Imagine a moonlit night on Tortuga, that legendary pirate haven off the northwest coast of Hispaniola. Tortuga was nominally French, but in reality, it was a lawless refuge where pirates of all nations gathered to refit ships, trade goods, and carouse. The harbour would be crowded with vessels of dubious provenance, their names painted over, their flags ready to change at a moment's notice. On the beach, a group of sailors sits around a fire, passing a bottle of rum. The bottle is clay, sealed with wax, the rum inside harsh and powerful, distilled from molasses in makeshift stills. The men drink steadily, but not desperately. Getting drunk before an operation is foolish, and these are professionals. They speak in a polyglot mixture of languages. The dominant tongue is a form of pidgin that mixes English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese, the lingua franca of the Caribbean underworld. But individual conversations slip into native languages, a Frenchman and a fellow Norman speaking rapid French, two Englishmen talking in London cant, a Portuguese sailor, and a Jewish companion conversing in Portuguese with Hebrew words mixed in. They are planning their next raid. Debate centers on which shipping lane to prowl, which Spanish settlement might have weak defenses, whether to attack a single large prize or multiple smaller targets. Each man has opinions based on experience and intelligence he has gathered. The discussion is animated but not heated. These men trust each other's judgment even when they disagree. Among them sits a Jewish sailor. His name is Isaac, though on ship rosters he sometimes uses Christian names to avoid complications. He is in his 30s, lean and sun-darkened, with a scar running from his left eyebrow into his hairline, a souvenir of a boarding action 2 years ago. He is quiet, watchful, speaking only when he has something substantive to add. He drinks less than the others, nurses the rum bottle before passing it on. The other sailors respect him. He has proven himself repeatedly, has scars to show he does not shirk from fighting. He is skilled with a cutlass, and even better with a pistol. His marksmanship has saved lives during battles. He can read and write, which makes him valuable for keeping logs and accounting. He knows the stars and can calculate positions. He speaks Spanish well enough to interrogate prisoners and Portuguese fluently, which is useful when they encounter Brazilian traders. But there is distance too. The others know he observes strange customs, that he refuses certain foods, that he disappears on Friday evenings and Saturday mornings when possible. They have seen him mumbling prayers in a language they don't understand. Some find this exotic, others unsettling. Most simply accept it as part of who he is, the way they accept that the French sailor crosses himself before battle, or the English gunner carries a rabbit's foot for luck. When the discussion turns to their target, Isaac contributes crucial information. He spoke yesterday with a merchant in the port, a fellow Jew who trades legitimately but keeps his ears open. A Spanish merchant vessel will be departing Santo Domingo in a week, carrying sugar and tobacco to Havana before joining a convoy to Spain. It will be lightly armed, only 6 guns, with a small crew. The merchant gave Isaac the ship's name and described its captain. The others listen carefully. This is valuable intelligence. They ask questions. How does Isaac's contact know this? Can the information be trusted? Isaac explains that his contact has business relationships in Santo Domingo. That information was obtained from bills of lading that passed through his warehouse. The explanation satisfies them. They know that Jewish merchants across the Caribbean form networks through which information flows, and they have learned to trust this intelligence. They decide to pursue this target. Lots are drawn for positions: who will lead the boarding party, who will command the cannons, who will take the helm during the action. It is all very businesslike, the distribution of risk and reward negotiated according to their articles. Isaac draws a position in the first boarding wave, which suits him fine. He prefers to be in the thick of action, where his fate depends on his own skill, rather than standing back hoping others will succeed. The fire bums down to coals. The men drift off to sleep where they sit or in hammocks slung between palm trees. The tropical night is alive with sounds: insects thrumming, waves lapping, somewhere a nightbird calling. Isaac remains awake a bit longer, looking up at the stars. He is thinking about his grandfather, who died in Lisbon shortly after the forced conversions, an old man broken by being dragged to a baptismal font and forcibly made Christian. His grandfather had been a respected scholar, a man who knew Talmud and philosophy, who had corresponded with rabbis across Europe. He died a converso, buried in Christian ground with Christian rites, denied even the dignity of burial according to his own traditions. Isaac touches the knife at his belt. Tomorrow or the next day, he will use this knife in anger, perhaps take lives, certainly risk his own. His grandfather would be horrified. Jewish law forbids violence except in self-defense, and piracy cannot reasonably be described as self-defense. But Isaac tells himself that his grandfather never understood the lesson that history taught. Passivity invites destruction. Turning the other cheek means having your throat cut. Here on Tortuga, surrounded by cutthroats and outcasts, Isaac is free in a way his grandfather never was. No one can force him to convert. No one can steal his property with legal impunity. No one can burn him for praying in Hebrew. If someone tries to harm him, he has a sword and the skill to use it. This is not the life his grandfather would have chosen for him, but it is the life circumstances have made possible. He finally sleeps, his hand resting on his knife hilt, ready to wake at the first sign of danger. Even in sleep, a pirate must be alert. Trust has limits when every man around you has killed and will kill again. Let this image fade now, the fire dying to darkness, the breathing of sleeping men merging with the rhythm of waves. Your own breathing slows to match. You are safe in your own place, far from Tortuga, far from danger. The past is another country, visited in imagination but unable to harm you. Of all the ports that served as havens for pirates and privateers in the Caribbean, none was more notorious than Port Royal, Jamaica. Before its destruction in the earthquake of 1692, it was arguably the wealthiest and wickedest city in the English-speaking New World, a place where fortunes were made and lost in a single night, where violence and commerce intertwined inextricably. Jamaica itself had a complex history. The Spanish had claimed it in the early 1500s, establishing settlements but never fully developing the island. They were more focused on the Greater Antilles, Cuba, and Hispaniola, and used Jamaica primarily as a supply station. The indigenous Taino population was decimated by disease and forced labor, essentially extinct within a generation of Spanish arrival. In 1655, England seized Jamaica as part of Oliver Cromwell's Western Design, an ambitious and largely failed plan to challenge Spanish power in the Caribbean. The English fleet that attacked was supposed to take Santo Domingo, but that assault failed disastrously. Rather than return to England empty-handed, the commanders decided to attack the less well-defended Jamaica. They succeeded, and Jamaica became an English colony, one of the few tangible results of Cromwell's expensive Caribbean campaign. The early years of English Jamaica were difficult. The Spanish conducted raids from Cuba, trying to recapture the island. Crops failed. Disease killed settlers. The English government, struggling with political turmoil at home, provided little support. The colony had to be self-sufficient, which meant encouraging whatever economic activities could generate revenue. Enter the privateers. The English governors of Jamaica quickly realized that licensed piracy could serve multiple purposes. It would harass Spanish shipping and settlements, weakening England's great imperial rival. It would bring wealth to Jamaica, as privateers would spend their prizes in Port Royal, and it would provide a ready force of armed men to defend the island if the Spanish attacked. Letters of marque were issued freely. Men like Christopher Mings, Edward Mansfield, and most famously Henry Morgan received commissions to attack Spanish targets. These were not mere pirates, but quasi-military commanders leading fleets of ships and thousands of men in elaborate campaigns against fortified cities. Port Royal, located on a spit of land protecting Kingston Harbour, became the operational base for this activity. Its deepwater harbour could accommodate large ships. Its location made it a natural stopping point for vessels traversing the Caribbean. And its English government, while nominally imposing law and order, was willing to look the other way when privateers engaged in activities that, strictly speaking, violated their commissions. The city grew rapidly and chaotically. Warehouses lined the waterfront. Taverns and brothels multiplied. Merchants set up shop to buy prizes and sell provisions. Craftsmen arrived to service ships, sailmakers, coopers, carpenters, rope makers, blacksmiths. A whole economy developed around piracy, employing hundreds of people who never went to sea but depended on privateer wealth for their livelihoods. By the 1660s, Port Royal was one of the wealthiest cities in the Americas. Contemporary accounts describe streets where gold and silver coins were common currency, where even slaves and servants had access to luxuries unimaginable in European cities. Merchants' houses were filled with plundered Spanish goods, fine furniture, paintings, silk, jewelry, porcelain from the China trade that had been transshipped through Acapulco. But the city also had a dark reputation. The same accounts that marveled at its wealth also condemned its vice. Gambling houses operated openly. Brothels were legion. Public drunkenness was commonplace. Violence was routine. Men settled disputes with knives and pistols, and the authorities rarely intervened unless the victim was someone important. Executions were public spectacles, with pirates hanged on gallows point, where their bodies would be left to rot as warnings to others. Into this environment came Jewish merchants and traders. They recognized Port Royal as an opportunity despite its dangers. Here, they could trade without the restrictions imposed in other colonies. They could purchase prizes at favorable prices from privateers eager to convert goods into coin. They could export to markets in English North America, where Jewish traders were less welcome, but Jewish goods faced no such discrimination. The Jewish community in Port Royal was small but significant. Records are fragmentary. Many were destroyed in the earthquake, but we know there was a Jewish quarter, that a synagogue existed, and that Jewish merchants owned warehouses and shops. The community included Sephardic refugees from Spanish territories, Jews from England and the Netherlands, and conversos who had fled Inquisition jurisdiction to openly reclaim Jewish identity. The relationship between this Jewish community and the privateer economy was intimate. Some Jewish merchants specialized in purchasing prize goods. When a privateer captured a Spanish ship, he needed to convert the cargo into money. He could not simply sail to Cartagena and sell sugar and tobacco. Those were enemy ports. But in Port Royal, merchants stood ready to buy cargoes with few questions asked about legal niceties. These transactions required expertise. A merchant had to assess the quality and quantity of goods quickly, determine fair market prices, and have sufficient capital or credit to make large purchases. Jewish merchants, drawing on centuries of trading experience and extensive networks, excelled at this. They could buy a cargo in Port Royal, export it to New York or Boston, and sell it there at a profit, all within a few months. They also extended credit to privateering expeditions. Outfitting a ship for a raid required significant capital, provisions, gunpowder, weapons, pay advances to crew members. A merchant might invest in an expedition, taking a share of any prizes in return. This was risky. Many expeditions returned empty-handed, some never returned at all. But the potential returns were enormous. A successful raid could yield 10 or 20 times the initial investment. Some Jewish merchants went further, actually participating in raids. David Abrabanel, mentioned earlier, was one such figure. Records place him as a participant in Henry Morgan's infamous 1671 raid on Panama City, one of the largest and most destructive privateer actions in Caribbean history. Morgan's raid on Panama was a massive undertaking. He assembled a fleet of over 30 ships and nearly 2,000 men. They sailed to the Isthmus of Panama, that narrow strip of land connecting North and South America, where the Spanish had established Panama City as the Pacific terminus of the treasure route from Peru. The privateers left their ships on the Caribbean side and marched overland through jungle and swamp, a grueling journey of several days. They fought Spanish defenders, captured and sacked the city, and held it for weeks while searching for treasure. The raid was tremendously destructive. Much of Panama City burned, though whether the fires were set by defenders or attackers remains debated. The amount of treasure seized was controversial. Morgan claimed the city had been largely evacuated before his arrival, that the Spanish had moved their wealth. His men suspected Morgan had cheated them out of their fair shares. Spanish sources claimed vast wealth was stolen. The truth, lost in the chaos and conflicting accounts, will never be fully known. David Abrabanel was there, one of nearly 2,000 privateers who participated. What exactly his role was, whether he fought in the assault, helped search for treasure, or stayed with the fleet, is unknown. But his presence is documented in the roster of participants. A Jew from Port Royal, sailing with Henry Morgan, attacking the heart of Spanish colonial power in the Americas. The historical ironies are profound. Imagine Port Royal in its prime, say the year 1670, before the Great Earthquake, at the height of its wealth and wickedness. Picture yourself walking down Thames Street, the main thoroughfare paralleling the waterfront. The street is unpaved, muddy when it rains, dusty when dry. Buildings crowd close on both sides, 2- and 3-story structures made of brick and wood, many with overhanging upper floors in the medieval English style. The noise is overwhelming. Sailors shouting to each other in a dozen languages, merchants hawking goods, the crack of hammers as coopers assemble barrels, the rasp of saws as carpenters work on ship repairs, music and laughter from taverns, screams and curses from a fight that has spilled into the street. Somewhere, a woman singing a bawdy song. Everywhere, the cries of seabirds wheeling overhead. The smell is equally intense. Salt and fish from the harbour, tar and pitch being heated for ship maintenance, rum and beer, sweat and sewage. Sanitation is primitive, and in the tropical heat, the stench of human waste is inescapable. Cooking smells from tavern kitchens, roasting meat, boiling stews, the sweet rot of tropical fruit left too long in the heat, tobacco smoke from the pipes and cigars that nearly every man carries. You pass a tavern called the Sign of the Mermaid. Through its open door, you see men drinking, some already drunk, though it's only mid-afternoon. A game of cards is in progress, significant money on the table. Two women in gaudy dresses sit on sailors' laps. The scene is one of careless indulgence, men spending in a day what labourers in England might earn in a year. Further down, a merchant's establishment, more respectable, though only barely. The ground floor is a shop selling provisions and equipment. Above are the merchant's private quarters. A sign in English and Hebrew identifies the proprietor as Samuel Pereira, merchant. Through the window, you see men examining bolts of silk, probably taken from a Spanish prize. In front of a warehouse, enslaved Africans load barrels onto a cart. They work in silence, their faces expressionless. The institution of slavery permeates Port Royal, as it does all Caribbean colonies. The wealth being generated depends fundamentally on enslaved labor, in the sugar fields that produce the crops, in the port where they load and unload ships, in the houses where they serve as domestic workers. This is the brutal foundation on which the entire Caribbean economy rests. At the end of Thames Street, near the harbour's edge, stands the synagogue. It is a modest building, nothing like the grand structures in Amsterdam, but serviceable. Its existence is both remarkable and precarious. Remarkable because Jews can worship here openly without fear of Inquisition raids. Precarious because the tolerance extended to Jews depends on the pragmatism of English governors who value economic contribution over religious conformity. That tolerance could evaporate if circumstances changed. Inside, the synagogue is simple but lovingly maintained. The ark holding the Torah scrolls dominates one wall. The scrolls themselves are old, brought from Amsterdam or rescued from Spanish territory. Benches provide seating. As in Curaçao, the floor is covered with sand, that multi-layered symbol of desert wandering and secret worship. On Shabbat, the synagogue fills with men at prayer. They wear their best clothes, well made but practical, the dress of successful merchants. They pray in Hebrew, the ancient language, following liturgy unchanged for centuries. For this one day a week, they step out of the violent commercial chaos of Port Royal and into a different world, one connected to thousands of years of tradition. After services, they linger, conducting business in low voices, sharing information. A ship is expected from Amsterdam with manufactured goods. The price of sugar is up in English markets. A privateer fleet is being organized. Investors are sought. The Spanish have reinforced the garrison at Santiago de Cuba. Each piece of information is valuable, filed away for future use. The community is small enough that everyone knows everyone. They attend each other's weddings and funerals. They settle disputes through their own internal arbitration rather than English courts. They maintain charitable funds to support the poor and to help new arrivals from Spanish territories who arrive with nothing. But they also know their position is vulnerable. They are foreigners in an English colony, Jews in a Christian society, merchants in a world of violence. They maintain a low profile, avoid flaunting their wealth, and cultivate good relationships with English officials through gifts and favors. They are always aware that the tolerance they enjoy could end, that they might have to flee again, to start over somewhere else. This awareness shapes their decisions. They keep their wealth liquid, in coins, bills of exchange, jewelry, rather than investing heavily in land or buildings. They maintain connections to Jewish communities in other ports, ready to leverage those networks if they must relocate. They are successful but not rooted, prosperous but not secure. This is the condition of diaspora, and they live it daily. Let the image of Port Royal settle in your mind, the noise and smell and colour, the wealth and vice, the violence and prayer coexisting in a small space, all of it perched precariously on a sandy spit of land that will one day vanish beneath the waves. History holds this city in amber, preserved at the moment of its destruction. But for now, in your imagination, it lives and breathes and roars with life. To understand the world of Jewish pirates and the larger pirate economy they were part of, we must understand that piracy in the Caribbean was not simply anarchic violence. It was, in many ways, a business, brutal and dangerous, but governed by its own economic logic, its own rules and conventions. Jewish merchants, with their centuries of trading experience, were particularly skilled at navigating this economy and profiting from it. The fundamental business model of piracy was simple: seize valuable goods by force and sell them. But the execution was far from simple. Every step involved risks, costs, and complex calculations. First, there was the matter of outfitting an expedition. A ship had to be obtained, either purchased, captured, or leased. This alone represented a substantial investment. A seaworthy vessel capable of carrying enough men and guns to take prizes might cost several thousand pieces of eight. Even a small ship required hundreds of pounds sterling. Then came the costs of equipping the ship. Cannons were expensive. A good cannon might cost 50 to 100 pieces of eight, and a ship needed multiple cannons to be effective. Gunpowder and shot had to be purchased. Small arms, pistols, muskets, cutlasses, pikes had to be provided for the crew. Navigation instruments, spare rigging, sailcloth, tools, water casks, food supplies. The list of necessary items was long, and the costs mounted quickly. Crew had to be recruited and paid. While pirates split prizes rather than receiving wages, they still needed advance payments to cover their expenses before sailing. A typical arrangement might give each crew member a small sum up front, perhaps 10 or 20 pieces of eight, to buy clothes and personal items and to provide for any family they were leaving behind. These upfront costs could easily total several thousand pieces of eight for even a modest expedition. Few individual ship captains had such capital. Instead, expeditions were typically financed by syndicates of investors, merchants, who would provide the necessary funds in exchange for a share of any prizes. This is where Jewish merchants found a particularly profitable niche. They had access to capital through their extended networks. A merchant in Port Royal could draw on credit from associates in Curaçao, Amsterdam, or London. They understood risk assessment and could evaluate whether a proposed expedition was likely to succeed. And they had the international connections needed to convert stolen goods into legitimate profits. The contracts drawn up for these investments were surprisingly sophisticated. They would specify exactly what share each investor would receive, how prizes would be divided between investors and crew, what expenses would be deducted before distribution, and how disputes would be resolved. These contracts had to account for numerous contingencies. What if the ship was damaged and required repairs? What if crew members died or were injured? What if the expedition returned empty-handed? Once an expedition was funded and launched, the next challenge was finding suitable targets. This required intelligence, information about Spanish shipping routes, knowledge of which merchant vessels were sailing when, understanding of which settlements had weak defenses and which were heavily fortified. Jewish merchants were valuable sources of such intelligence. Their trading networks spanned the Caribbean and extended back to Europe. A merchant in Curaçao might hear from a correspondent in Amsterdam about ships leaving Spanish ports. A trader in Port Royal might learn from agents in Spanish colonies about treasure shipments being organized. This information, shared discreetly, could mean the difference between a successful raid and a wasted voyage. When a prize was taken, the next phase began, converting the captured goods into money. This process was more complex than it might seem. A ship captured in the Caribbean might be carrying sugar, tobacco, indigo, cochineal, logwood, hides, cacao, or any of dozens of other commodities. The privateer captain had to quickly decide what to do with these goods. Some cargoes were perishable and had to be sold quickly. Fresh provisions, for instance, would spoil in the tropical heat. Other goods were bulky and required substantial warehouse space. Some commodities had volatile prices that might change significantly between the time of capture and eventual sale. The captain had to make these assessments while also managing his crew, maintaining his ship, and watching for Spanish warships that might be pursuing him. This is where merchants like Samuel Pereira in Port Royal earned their profits. They would purchase entire cargoes, taking on the risk and complexity of warehousing and resale. The privateer captain received immediate payment, perhaps not full market value, but immediate liquidity that could be distributed to the crew and investors. The merchant then worked to maximize the value of the goods, selling them to whoever would pay the best price. These transactions existed in a legal gray area. Technically, prizes were supposed to be adjudicated by admiralty courts, which would determine if the capture was legal and authorize the sale. In practice, this formal process was often bypassed or corrupted. Merchants would purchase goods before any court had validated the capture. Officials would receive bribes to overlook irregularities. Ships' cargoes would be described inaccurately on bills of lading to avoid taxes or to conceal stolen goods. Jewish merchants, operating across jurisdictional boundaries and maintaining networks independent of any single government, were particularly well positioned to facilitate these grey market transactions. A cargo purchased in Port Royal might be reshipped to Curaçao, where it would appear in records as legitimately traded goods. From there, it might go to Amsterdam, where it would enter European markets with no trace of its piratical origins. The Spanish silver that had been mined by forced indigenous labor in Potosi, shipped to Cartagena, captured by privateers off Cuba, and sold in Port Royal might end up as coins in London, passed through so many hands that its provenance was untraceable. The most valuable commodity, of course, was Spanish silver. The mines of Potosi in Peru and Zacatecas in Mexico produced vast quantities of silver, which Spain used to finance its European wars and to purchase goods from Asia. This silver flowed through established routes, from the mines to Pacific ports, across Panama or around Cape Horn, then to Cartagena or Havana, and finally to Spain in the annual treasure fleets. Silver had multiple advantages as plunder. It was valuable, compact, and universally accepted. A chest of silver reals could be easily divided among crew members and investors. It didn't spoil or require special storage. It could be spent anywhere or converted into local currency. For these reasons, treasure ships carrying silver were the most coveted prizes. But silver presented challenges too. The Spanish protected their treasure fleets carefully, using armed escorts and traveling in convoys. They timed departures to avoid hurricane season. They varied routes to make interception difficult. Successfully attacking a treasure fleet, as Moses Cohen Henriques did in 1628, required extensive planning, substantial force, and considerable luck. More commonly, privateers targeted smaller vessels, individual merchant ships carrying mixed cargoes, coastal traders moving between Spanish colonies, supply ships traveling to isolated settlements. These prizes were less dramatic, but more reliably profitable. A privateer might capture several such vessels in a single cruise, accumulating modest amounts of wealth that, taken together, provided a solid return on investment. The division of prizes followed established formulas that were surprisingly consistent across different pirate and privateer crews. These formulas were specified in the articles that crew members signed before sailing. Violating the agreed-upon division was considered one of the worst offences a captain could commit and could lead to mutiny or worse. A typical division might work like this. First, the expenses of the voyage would be deducted: costs of repairs, replacement supplies, medical care for wounded crew members. Next, the investors who had funded the expedition would receive their agreed-upon share, often between 1/3 and 1/2 of the remaining value. What was left was divided among the crew, but not equally. The captain typically received 5 or 6 shares. The quartermaster, who managed day-to-day operations and often served as a check on the captain's power, might receive 4 shares. Skilled crew members, the pilot who navigated, the surgeon who treated injuries, the gunners who aimed the cannons, might receive 2 or 3 shares. Common sailors received 1 share each. Additionally, there were bonus payments for specific acts. The first man to spot a prize might receive an extra payment. The first to board an enemy vessel during an attack would get more. Anyone who lost a limb or suffered serious injury was entitled to compensation from the common fund. The amounts were specified in the articles, like an early form of workers' compensation. This system of shares meant that everyone on the ship had a direct financial interest in the success of the voyage. It also created a form of rough democracy. Since the common sailors collectively held most of the shares, they had leverage over captains and officers. A captain who was incompetent, cowardly, or who tried to cheat the crew could be voted out and replaced. Jewish pirates and merchants operated within this system, but also brought their own cultural practices to it. Jewish law has extensive regulations about partnerships and profit sharing, developed over centuries of commercial activity. These halachic principles sometimes informed how Jewish investors structured their deals. For example, Jewish law has complex rules about ribbit, usury. While Christians were theoretically forbidden from charging interest to other Christians, though this was widely evaded, Jews had their own set of restrictions about charging interest to fellow Jews. Jewish merchants investing in privateering expeditions had to structure their arrangements carefully to avoid violating these rules. They might take a partnership share rather than lending money at interest, or they might use various legal fictions recognized in Jewish law to permit what was functionally an interest-bearing loan. Additionally, Jewish merchants had to navigate questions about the permissibility of trading in captured goods under Jewish law. While self-defense was clearly permitted, and by extension fighting against persecutors, the status of piracy more generally was ambiguous. Rabbinical authorities in different communities took different positions. Some were pragmatic, recognizing that privateering with a letter of marque was functionally a form of warfare and therefore permissible. Others were more stringent, arguing that theft was theft regardless of legal cover. In practice, most Jewish merchants involved in the privateer economy seemed to take a pragmatic view. They were operating in a diaspora situation, in colonies where Jewish law had no official standing. They had to make a living in the economy that existed, not the ideal economy they might prefer. As long as they observed Shabbat, kept kosher, circumcised their sons, and supported the community, questions about the moral status of trading in captured Spanish goods were set aside. There was also a certain amount of rationalization available. The Spanish had expelled and murdered Jews. They had stolen Jewish property through the Inquisition. They had forced conversions and separated families. From this perspective, taking Spanish silver was not theft, but recovery of stolen goods, or at least justified retaliation. Whether this argument would satisfy rigorous Talmudic analysis was debatable, but it provided psychological comfort to those engaged in the trade. The economics of piracy also had broader implications for Caribbean society. The wealth flowing through ports like Port Royal, Tortuga, and Curaçao supported entire communities. Tavern keepers, prostitutes, ship chandlers, carpenters, sailmakers, blacksmiths, farmers, and fishermen all depended directly or indirectly on privateer money. Governments collected taxes on prizes and import/export duties on goods flowing through their ports. This created interest groups that supported privateering even when it complicated diplomacy relations. English merchants in Jamaica benefited from privateering and lobbied London to continue issuing letters of marque. Dutch merchants in Curaçao profited from the trade in prizes and pressured the West India Company to maintain policies favorable to privateers. Even Spanish colonial officials sometimes collaborated with privateers despite official Spanish opposition, taking bribes to allow captured goods to be sold in Spanish ports. Jewish merchants, with their international networks and linguistic abilities, were particularly valuable as intermediaries in these complex arrangements. A Jewish merchant might buy goods from an English privateer in Port Royal, transport them to Curaçao where he had family connections, and then arrange for them to be sold to Spanish merchants in Venezuela or New Granada, all while managing the paperwork and bribes necessary to make these transactions appear legitimate. The profit margins on such operations could be substantial, justifying the considerable risks involved. But risks were indeed considerable. The line between privateering and piracy was often blurred, and penalties for piracy were severe. Men convicted of piracy were hanged, their bodies often displayed in cages at harbor entrances as warnings. Merchants who dealt in obviously pirated goods could have their property confiscated, and warfare between European powers was intermittent. A merchant who prospered during wartime by trading prizes might find himself in legal jeopardy when peace was declared, and yesterday's privateering became today's piracy. Jewish merchants, as a vulnerable minority, had to be particularly careful. They could not afford to be too visibly associated with illegal activity. They maintained a veneer of respectability, kept meticulous records, even if those records didn't tell the whole truth, and cultivated relationships with officials who could provide protection if questions arose. Imagine now a counting house in Curaçao, the office of a prosperous Jewish merchant named Abraham Cohen. The room is spare but well appointed. A large desk dominates the space, covered with papers, bills of lading, correspondence, account ledgers. Shelves hold more ledgers, years of commercial records. A small window looks out over the harbor, where ships rock at anchor. Abraham sits at his desk, quill in hand, working through accounts. He is 50 years old, grey-bearded, wearing dark clothes of good quality but sober style. On his head is a skull cap. Reading glasses perch on his nose, a luxury, expensive but necessary for the detailed work of keeping accounts. He is calculating the profit on a recent transaction. An English privateer, a Captain Morrison, captured a Spanish merchant vessel off the coast of Hispaniola 2 months ago. The ship was carrying sugar, tobacco, and a quantity of worked silver, plates, candlesticks, religious objects. Morrison brought the prize to Curaçao and approached Abraham to purchase the cargo. Abraham had to move carefully. The sugar and tobacco were straightforward. He could buy them, store them in his warehouse, and resell them to Dutch merchants who would export them to Europe. But the silver goods were more complicated. Worked silver was distinctive, could potentially be traced back to owners in Spanish territory. If he purchased them, he would be trafficking in stolen goods, which was risky, but the profit potential was significant. Morrison was asking for less than half the silver's value. He wanted quick cash and was willing to accept a low price for immediate payment. Abraham could hold the silver temporarily, have it melted down and recast into standardized ingots, and then sell those ingots, which would be untraceable. The profit margin would be substantial, perhaps 40 or 50%. The risks had to be weighed. If someone complained to Dutch authorities, if Morrison was later charged with piracy and Abraham's name came up during the trial, if Spanish spies in Curaçao reported his involvement, any of these could lead to serious trouble. But Abraham had relationships with Dutch officials. He had made strategic gifts, provided low-interest loans, supported the church financially despite being Jewish. These relationships provided a buffer of protection. He decided to proceed, but with precautions. He would not deal directly with Morrison. Instead, he used an intermediary, a Portuguese trader who asked fewer questions and had his own reasons for keeping transactions quiet. The intermediary purchased the silver goods from Morrison and then resold them to Abraham at a modest markup. This provided Abraham with deniability. He could claim he purchased the silver from a legitimate trader, not directly from a privateer. The sugar and tobacco he bought directly, negotiating a favorable price. Morrison was pleased with the immediate payment and sailed off to spend his money in Port Royal. The intermediary made a small profit on the silver transaction, and Abraham stood to make a substantial profit on all of it, assuming the resales went as planned. These were the calculations that occupied merchant minds, the constant weighing of profit against risk, the management of relationships and information and timing. It was mentally exhausting work, requiring constant attention to detail, awareness of political and military developments that could affect trade, and cultivation of a network of contacts who could provide intelligence and assistance. Abraham's day would be filled with such transactions and calculations. He might meet with ship captains to discuss freight rates, with local farmers to purchase provisions he could resell to ships, with Dutch officials to discuss tax matters, with fellow Jewish merchants to coordinate on community affairs. In the evening, he would return home to his family, say his prayers, eat dinner, and perhaps study Talmud for an hour before bed. His life was a constant movement between different worlds, the rough world of Caribbean commerce, the formal world of colonial administration, the spiritual world of Jewish practice. Your eyes are heavy now. The details of accounting and trade blur together, numbers swimming before your vision like fish in dark water. You don't need to follow the complexities of these transactions. Let them fade into background hum, the sound of a world going about its business while you drift towards sleep. Throughout this story, we have focused primarily on men, pirates, merchants, sailors, rabbis. This reflects the historical record, which is overwhelmingly dominated by male voices and male actions. But women were also part of this world, and though their stories are harder to recover, they deserve attention. In the Caribbean colonies of the 17th century, women's roles were circumscribed by law and custom. They could not vote, hold public office, or in most cases own property independently of fathers or husbands. Their primary expected roles were as wives and mothers, managers of households, rather than participants in public commerce or politics. But reality was always more complex than prescription. The Caribbean was a frontier region where social norms were more fluid than in European heartlands. The constant violence, the high death rates from disease and warfare, the shortage of women in many colonies, all these factors created opportunities for women to step outside traditional roles. Jewish women in Caribbean ports faced additional layers of complexity. They were minorities within minorities, Jewish in Christian colonies, women in male-dominated societies. Yet some managed to carve out significant roles for themselves, particularly in commerce. When a Jewish merchant husband was at sea, whether on legitimate trading voyages or privateering expeditions, his wife often managed his business affairs on land. She would oversee warehouses, manage accounts, negotiate with customers, and make business decisions. These were not ceremonial roles, but real executive authority. A merchant's wife had to understand accounting, assess credit risks, negotiate prices, and manage workers. Some women went further, establishing independent business operations. Records from Curaçao mention a Judith Cohen who operated a tavern that catered to sailors. Taverns were crucial nodes in the maritime information network. Sailors drank and talked, sharing gossip about ships, cargoes, destinations, and opportunities. A sharp-eared tavern keeper could gather valuable intelligence. Whether Judith Cohen was also passing information to privateer contacts is impossible to know, but it seems likely. A tavern keeper who developed a reputation for discretion might learn about Spanish shipping movements from sailors who had been in Spanish ports, about upcoming privateer expeditions from crew members being recruited, about what goods were in demand and what prices were being offered. This information had value and could be traded or sold. Other women managed more substantial operations. Rachel de Barrios in Port Royal ran a significant lending operation, extending credit to merchants and ship captains. This was a risky business. Maritime commerce was unpredictable, and borrowers might die or disappear before repaying loans. But the potential returns justified the risks, and Rachel apparently prospered, leaving a substantial estate when she died in the 1680s. The historical record tells us that Rachel lent money to both Jewish and Christian borrowers, that she charged interest rates comparable to male moneylenders, and that she successfully pursued legal action against those who defaulted. This suggests a woman who commanded respect in the commercial world, who could navigate the English legal system despite being both Jewish and female, and who had sufficient capital to absorb occasional losses. How did Rachel accumulate her initial capital? The records don't say. Perhaps she inherited from a deceased husband. Perhaps she was a successful merchant in her own right before turning to money lending. Perhaps she had access to family capital from relatives in other ports. Whatever the source, she deployed it effectively, building a profitable business in one of the Caribbean's most notorious cities. Some Jewish women may have gone to sea themselves, though evidence for this is sparse and circumstantial. The historical record of women pirates in general is thin. The most famous examples are Mary Read and Anne Bonny, who sailed with Calico Jack Rackham in the early 1700s. Both women dressed as men, fought in combat, and by all accounts were as fierce and capable as any male pirate. If English Christian women could become pirates, is it impossible that Jewish women did so as well? The pirate world, with its democratic crew structures and focus on competence over convention, might have been more accepting of women who could prove their worth than conventional society. A woman who could handle a cutlass, load and fire a musket, and work the rigging would be valuable regardless of gender. However, we must be cautious about speculation. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but neither can we simply assume that Jewish women pirates existed just because we would like them to have existed. What we can say with confidence is that women were part of the ecosystem that made piracy possible, even if they were not themselves boarding Spanish ships with cutlasses in hand. Consider the life of Esther Rodriguez, a composite figure based on multiple fragmentary historical accounts. Esther lives in Willemstad, Curaçao in the year 1665. She is 32 years old, married to a merchant named Isaac who trades in sugar and tobacco. They have 3 children, 2 daughters aged 10 and 7, and a son aged 4. Isaac is away much of the time, traveling between Caribbean ports and occasionally to Amsterdam to manage business affairs. While he is gone, which might be months at a stretch, Esther manages everything. She oversees their household, a substantial task in itself, requiring management of servants, food supplies, clothing, and the education of the children in Hebrew and Portuguese. But she also manages Isaac's business affairs. She maintains correspondence with his business partners in other ports, writing letters in Portuguese and Spanish to update them on market conditions in Curaçao and to coordinate shipments. She reviews accounts with the bookkeeper Isaac employs, checking for errors or discrepancies. She makes decisions about extending credit to customers and pursuing payment from those who are overdue. When a ship arrives with goods Isaac has ordered, Esther goes to the warehouse to inspect them. She checks quantities against bills of lading, assesses quality, and determines what prices she can charge when reselling. If she determines that the goods are substandard or that the market is oversupplied, she might send a letter to Isaac suggesting he modify future orders. She also gathers information. In the market, buying vegetables and fish, she listens to gossip. Which ships have arrived, which have departed, what cargoes they carried, where they were bound. In synagogue, after services, she talks with other women, learning what their husbands have written in recent letters, what news has arrived from Amsterdam or Port Royal or Barbados. She processes all this information, looking for patterns and opportunities. One day, a ship captain approaches her. His name is Samuel Levy, a distant cousin of Isaac's, also a Sephardic Jew from Amsterdam. He's planning a voyage to Jamaica and needs to purchase supplies: salted meat, hardtack, rum, rope, canvas for sail repairs. He would normally deal with Isaac, but Isaac is currently in Amsterdam and won't return for another 2 months. Can Esther provide these goods on credit, to be repaid when Samuel returns from Jamaica? Esther has to make a quick assessment. She knows Samuel's reputation. He is considered reliable, has successfully completed similar voyages before. But she also knows that Caribbean voyages are inherently risky. Ships sink in storms, are captured by Spanish warships, or simply disappear for unknown reasons. If Samuel fails to return, Isaac's business will absorb the loss of the goods provided on credit. She asks probing questions. What exactly is Samuel's business in Jamaica? He is vague, saying only that he is carrying manufactured goods from Amsterdam to sell there and will return with sugar. But Esther, experienced in the evasions and half-truths of Caribbean commerce, understands what he is not saying. Samuel is probably involved in privateering in some capacity, perhaps transporting goods for privateers, perhaps investing in expeditions, perhaps something more direct. This makes the risk higher. Privateering voyages are more dangerous than straightforward trading voyages, but they are also more profitable, which means Samuel is more likely to be able to repay the debt with interest. Esther decides to extend the credit, but with conditions. She will provide the supplies, but Samuel must pay a higher interest rate than she would charge for a standard trading voyage, and he must leave a deposit, not enough to cover the full value of the goods, but enough to demonstrate his serious intent. Samuel agrees. The supplies are provided. He sails for Jamaica. 3 months later, he returns successfully, repays the debt with interest, and provides Esther with a bonus payment to thank her for her trust. He also brings a letter from Isaac, updating her on affairs in Amsterdam and praising her for her management of things in Curaçao. This is the sort of decision-making that merchant wives engaged in regularly. They were not passive housekeepers, but active economic agents, making judgments that affected family fortunes. Their work was essential to the functioning of Caribbean commerce, even though it rarely appeared in official records or history books. Women also played crucial roles in maintaining Jewish communal life. The synagogue was a male space. Women were not counted in the minyan, the quorum needed for prayer, and did not read from the Torah or lead services, but women maintained the household observances that defined Jewish identity. They kept kosher kitchens, prepared Shabbat meals, taught children their first Hebrew letters and prayers, and observed the laws of family purity. In the Caribbean diaspora, where Jewish communities were small and vulnerable, these domestic observances took on heightened importance. A family that ate forbidden foods, that did not observe Shabbat, that did not circumcise sons or provide Jewish education, such a family would assimilate within a generation or two. Women were the guardians against that assimilation, maintaining traditions in the home even when husbands were away for months at sea. Women also managed the community's charitable activities. Jewish tradition places great emphasis on tzedakah, righteous giving to those in need. In Caribbean Jewish communities, this often took the form of helping new arrivals, refugees from Spanish territories who arrived with nothing, needing food, shelter, and help finding work. Women organized these relief efforts, collecting donations, preparing meals, finding housing, and providing basic necessities. Additionally, women nursed the sick and prepared bodies for burial according to Jewish law. In an era before modern medicine, disease was rampant in the Caribbean. Yellow fever epidemics could kill dozens or hundreds in a matter of weeks. Wealthy and poor alike needed care when they fell ill, and women provided that care, often at risk to their own health. All of this work was essential but largely invisible. Women's names rarely appear in official records unless they were involved in legal disputes or left wills disposing of property. Their letters have mostly not survived. Their daily activities were not considered worthy of documentation by the men who kept records. Imagine Esther Rodriguez on a Friday evening preparing for Shabbat. The sun is setting over the Caribbean, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. In her kitchen, enslaved servants work under her direction, preparing the Shabbat meal. She has checked every pot and pan, every ingredient, ensuring everything is kosher according to her understanding of Jewish law. The table is set with a white cloth. 2 braided challah loaves made from wheat flour imported from Europe at considerable expense rest under an embroidered cover. Silver candlesticks, perhaps acquired as part of the dowry she brought to her marriage, perhaps inherited from her mother, stand ready. A cup for Kiddush, the blessing over wine, waits to be filled. Her daughters help her light the candles as the sun touches the horizon. She covers her eyes and recites the blessing in Hebrew, her voice soft but clear. For this moment, the chaos and violence of Caribbean life recedes. She is connected to Jewish women across the world performing this same ritual, to her mother and grandmother before her, to countless generations stretching back to ancient times. Her son, still too young to attend synagogue services, watches with wide eyes. He will learn these rituals by seeing them performed, week after week, year after year. When he is older, when he understands more, she will explain the meanings, the stories behind the traditions, the reasons for the laws. But for now, it is enough that he sees, that he absorbs the rhythms of Jewish life through repetition and observation. When Isaac is home, he will lead the Kiddush and the blessings over bread, but he has been away for 3 months, and there is no knowing when he will return. So Esther recites the blessings herself, her daughters echoing her words. They are a family incomplete, a common reality in this world of maritime commerce, but they maintain the traditions nonetheless. After dinner, after the children are in bed, Esther sits in the courtyard of her house, looking up at the stars. She is tired. Managing the household and the business and the children is exhausting. She worries about Isaac, about whether he is safe, whether his ship has encountered storms or pirates or disease. She worries about money, about whether the debts owed to them will be repaid, about whether they are saving enough for the children's futures. But she also feels a quiet satisfaction. She has kept everything running. The business has not collapsed in Isaac's absence. The children are healthy and well educated. The household observes Jewish law. She has fulfilled her responsibilities, and more than that, she has proven herself capable. When Isaac returns, he will find everything in order, will approve of the decisions she has made, will understand that he can trust her completely. A warm breeze carries the scent of salt and flowers. The sound of waves is a constant backdrop, the breathing of the ocean that surrounds this small island. Esther feels herself relaxing, the tensions of the day draining away. She closes her eyes just for a moment, just to rest them. Among the folklore that developed in Caribbean Jewish communities, one particularly intriguing strand connects to the famous Golem of Prague legend. This may seem surprising. What would a Central European Jewish legend have to do with Caribbean pirates? But the Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jewish worlds, though distinct, were not completely separate, and stories traveled along the same routes that carried goods and people. The Golem legend, in its most famous version, tells of Rabbi Judah Loew ben Bezalel of Prague, known as the Maharal, who in the late 16th century created an artificial man from clay to protect the Jewish community from pogroms. The Golem, brought to life through Kabbalistic rituals involving the secret names of God, served as a protector, but eventually grew dangerous and had to be deactivated. This story resonated deeply with Jews across the diaspora. It spoke to a fundamental longing, the desire for power, for protection, for a defender who could stand against enemies. For communities that had experienced persecution, the Golem represented the fantasy of not being helpless, of having a champion who could fight back. In the Caribbean, where Sephardic Jews encountered Ashkenazi Jews who knew the Golem's story, the legend took on new dimensions. Some claimed that certain rabbi merchants who engaged in privateering possessed Kabbalistic knowledge that allowed them to protect their ships through supernatural means. Others told stories of clay figures placed on ships as guardians, brought partially to life through mystical formulas. These stories almost certainly have no basis in reality. They are folklore, wish fulfillment, the same impulse that creates superhero myths in any culture that feels threatened. But they tell us something important about how Caribbean Jews understood themselves and their situation. One story that circulated in Curaçao in the late 17th century involved a ship called the Shield of Abraham. According to the tale, this ship was owned and captained by a rabbi named Chaim ibn Ezra, a scholar who had studied Kabbalah in Safed before coming to the Caribbean. The ship's crew was entirely Jewish, and it sailed under a flag bearing the Star of David in Hebrew letters. The Shield of Abraham, so the story went, was protected by a golem that Rabbi Chaim had created. The golem did not appear as a crew member, but manifested when the ship was in danger. When Spanish warships attacked, the golem would cause their cannons to misfire. When storms threatened, the golem would calm the waters. When the crew needed wind, the golem would summon favorable breezes. The Shield of Abraham, protected by this supernatural guardian, was supposedly never captured, never sunk, never even damaged in combat. It raided Spanish shipping with impunity, taking prize after prize, enriching the Jewish community of Curaçao and making Rabbi Chaim wealthy beyond measure. Eventually, according to the story, Rabbi Chaim grew old and knew he must deactivate the golem before he died, lest it fall into the wrong hands or become uncontrollable. On the Sabbath before his death, he performed the ritual to remove the divine name from the golem's forehead, and the clay figure crumbled to dust. Rabbi Chaim died shortly afterward, and the shield of Abraham was never seen again, having perhaps sailed into the realm of legend where it always truly belonged. Is there any historical basis for this story? Almost certainly not. No records mention a ship called Shield of Abraham or a rabbi captain named Chaim ibn Ezra. The details are too perfect, too mythic. The story has all the hallmarks of folklore: the wise protagonist, the supernatural helper, the impossible successes, the tidy resolution. But the story persisted because it served psychological and cultural needs. It allowed Jews to imagine themselves not as victims, but as wielders of power, not just physical power, but mystical power rooted in their own religious tradition. It suggested that Jewish knowledge, Kabbalah, the secret wisdom, could be a weapon as effective as cannons and cutlasses. Moreover, the story created a connection between the ancient mystical traditions of Judaism and the rough practical world of Caribbean privateering. It suggested that these were not separate realms, but could be integrated, that a man could be both a scholar of sacred texts and a fighter against enemies, that religious devotion and violent resistance were not contradictory, but complementary. Other Caribbean golem stories featured different variations. Some told of small clay figures that Jewish merchants kept in their warehouses to guard against theft. These figures would supposedly come alive at night, patrolling the premises and frightening away burglars. Others spoke of golems created to perform heavy labor, loading and unloading ships, moving barrels and crates, work that would otherwise require enslaved or hired workers. These stories often had moral dimensions. A golem created for protection would serve faithfully, but a golem created out of greed or for unworthy purposes would turn on its creator. This reflected traditional Jewish ethical teaching that power must be wielded responsibly, that supernatural knowledge is dangerous if not balanced with wisdom and righteousness. The golem stories also reflected the cultural interchange happening in the Caribbean. African slaves brought their own traditions of protective magic and animated figures. Indigenous Caribbean peoples had their own mythologies. These traditions mixed and influenced each other in the diverse environment of Caribbean ports. A Jewish merchant might hear African stories about protective spirits, which would then influence how he understood and retold the golem legend. This syncretism, the blending of different cultural and religious traditions, was common in the Caribbean, but often unofficial and unacknowledged. Officially, Jews maintained strict boundaries between Judaism and other traditions, but in practice, living alongside Christians, Africans, and indigenous peoples, cultural exchange was inevitable. Stories borrowed from each other, practices influenced each other, even as each community maintained its distinct identity. Picture a tavern in Port Royal on a stormy night. Rain pounds on the roof, wind howls outside. The tavern is crowded with sailors and merchants seeking shelter. They drink rum and tell stories to pass the time until the storm passes. An English sailor tells a ghost story about a phantom ship he claims to have seen in the fog off Hispaniola, a vessel with tattered sails and a skeleton crew sailing forever as punishment for some ancient crime. His audience shivers appreciatively. A Spanish merchant, drunk enough to forget old enmities, tells about the La Llorona, the weeping woman who haunts rivers and lakes in Mexico, searching for her drowned children. His voice drops to a whisper as he describes her ghostly wailing. An African sailor, free or enslaved, it's not clear, speaks of Anansi the spider, the trickster who outsmarts larger and more powerful animals through cleverness. His story is funny and wise, drawing laughter and nods of recognition. Then a Jewish merchant named Benjamin stands and tells the story of the Golem of Prague, adapting it for his Caribbean audience. He describes how Rabbi Lowe created the creature from clay, how it protected the Jewish quarter from attackers, how it eventually grew too powerful and had to be destroyed. He embellishes, adding details about the golem fighting multiple armed men simultaneously, about it lifting enormous stones with ease, about the terror in the eyes of those who tried to harm Jews under its protection. The audience listens raptly. The story speaks to something universal, the fantasy of having a protector, of not being vulnerable, of being able to fight back against those who threaten you. Christians, Jews, Africans, Spanish, English, all understand this longing. When Benjamin finishes, there is a moment of silence. Then someone asks, "Could such a creature be made here, in the Caribbean?" Benjamin smiles but shakes his head. The knowledge is secret, known only to the greatest rabbis and Kabbalists, and even if one could create a golem, it would be dangerous. Such power is not to be wielded lightly. But the idea has been planted. In the weeks and months that follow, the story will be retold, will be modified, will eventually transform into the tale of the Shield of Abraham and Rabbi Chaim ibn Ezra. The story will become part of Caribbean Jewish folklore, will be whispered about in synagogues, will be used to frighten children into good behavior and to comfort adults who fear Spanish raids. The storm passes. The sailors and merchants leave the tavern and return to their ships and homes. Life continues, but the stories remain, traveling through time, connecting past to present, providing meaning and comfort to those who hear them. Let these stories wash over you now, folkloric and dreamlike, blending together like the cultures that created them. The boundary between waking and sleeping grows thin. You are drifting into a realm where stories and dreams are indistinguishable, where anything is possible, where clay can walk and ships can fly, and the oppressed can become powerful. All things end, and the golden age of Caribbean piracy was no exception. Multiple forces combined to bring about its decline, changing politics in Europe, strengthening of colonial navies, treaties between warring powers, and for Port Royal specifically, a catastrophic natural disaster that came to be seen as divine judgment. June 7th, 1692 began as an ordinary day in Port Royal. The weather was hot and clear, typical for early summer in Jamaica. The harbour was full of ships. The streets bustled with commerce. Merchants conducted business. Sailors drank in taverns. Children played. Life proceeded with its usual mixture of industry and vice. At approximately 11:43 in the morning, the earthquake struck. It was massive, estimated in modern terms as having a magnitude between 7 and 7.5. The shaking lasted for several minutes, though to those experiencing it, it must have felt like an eternity. The ground liquefied. This is a phenomenon that occurs when saturated sandy soil is subjected to strong shaking. The sand particles lose cohesion and the ground effectively turns to liquid. Buildings constructed on this liquefied ground simply sank. Large portions of Port Royal slid into the harbour. 2/3 of the city disappeared beneath the waves within minutes. Buildings collapsed. People were crushed under falling masonry or sucked down as the ground gave way beneath them. Ships in the harbour were tossed about, some capsizing, others crashing into each other or being driven into the sinking city. The death toll was catastrophic. Initial estimates suggested that about 2,000 people died immediately in the earthquake and the tsunamis that followed. Another 3,000 died in the subsequent weeks from injuries, disease, and exposure. The total population of Port Royal at the time was perhaps 6,000 to 8,000, meaning that more than half the population died. The Jewish community of Port Royal was not spared. The synagogue was destroyed, either sinking into the harbour or collapsing from the shaking. Jewish homes and warehouses were lost. Many Jews died in the disaster. Those who survived were left destitute, their property gone, their livelihood destroyed. Contemporary accounts describe apocalyptic scenes, the ground opening and swallowing people, corpses floating in the harbor, looters picking through ruins while the injured cried for help, disease spreading rapidly through the survivors who lacked clean water and adequate shelter, the smell of death permeating everything as bodies decomposed in the tropical heat. Many interpreted the earthquake as divine punishment. Port Royal had been notorious for its vice, the drinking, gambling, prostitution, and violence that characterized the city. Religious authorities had long condemned it as a modern Sodom. When the earthquake struck, these same authorities proclaimed that God had finally delivered judgment, that Port Royal had been destroyed as a warning to other sinful cities. This interpretation was particularly pointed when directed at Jews. Some Christian preachers explicitly claimed that the presence of Jews in Port Royal, their worship of God according to Jewish rather than Christian understanding, their involvement in the privateer economy, all of this had offended the Christian God and brought down divine wrath. For Jewish survivors, this accusation was both insulting and dangerous. They had done nothing different than their Christian neighbors. The privateers included Christians and Jews alike. The merchants who dealt in prizes were of multiple faiths. The vices of Port Royal were not uniquely Jewish. Yet Jews, as a vulnerable minority, became convenient scapegoats for a natural disaster that had natural causes. Most Jewish survivors left Port Royal. Some moved to Kingston, a nearby settlement on the mainland that became Jamaica's new commercial center. Others relocated to other Caribbean islands, Curaçao, Barbados, Nevis. Some returned to Europe or went to the English North American colonies. The Jewish community that had existed in Port Royal was scattered, never to be fully reconstituted. The earthquake also marked a broader turning point in Caribbean history. Port Royal had been the most important pirate haven in the English Caribbean, the place where privateers gathered, where prizes were sold, where expeditions were organized. Its destruction disrupted these networks. While piracy continued, it would persist in various forms for another generation. It never again reached the scale and organization that had characterized the 1660s through 1680s. Moreover, European politics were changing in ways that reduced official support for privateering. The War of the Grand Alliance, which had pitted England and the Netherlands against France, ended in 1697 with the Treaty of Ryswick. During the subsequent period of peace, what had been legal privateering became illegal piracy. Men who had operated with letters of marque suddenly found themselves outlaws. Spain, though weakened, remained a significant power. The War of Spanish Succession, fought from 1701 to 1714, actually brought England and Spain into alliance against France. This made attacks on Spanish shipping problematic for English privateers. Yesterday's enemy was today's ally, and treaties had to be respected. The strengthening of colonial navies also mattered. In the early 1600s, European powers had weak naval presence in the Caribbean. Spain claimed vast territories but could not effectively patrol them. England, France, and the Netherlands operated through a mix of colonial militias and licensed privateers. But by the early 1700s, all these powers were maintaining stronger naval forces in the Caribbean, making piracy more dangerous and less profitable. Economic changes played a role too. The Caribbean economy was maturing. Sugar plantations were becoming more established and profitable, providing legitimate economic opportunities. The rough frontier quality of the early colonial period was giving way to more settled societies with established hierarchies and laws. Merchants who might have engaged in privateering in 1660 were prospering through legitimate trade by 1710 and had no interest in destabilizing the economic system they now profited from. For Jewish communities, These changes brought both benefits and losses. The decline of piracy meant the loss of economic opportunities that had enriched some Jewish merchants, but it also meant greater security and stability. As Caribbean societies matured, Jewish communities could focus on building institutions, better synagogues, schools, charitable organizations, without constantly worrying about violence and instability. Imagine standing on what remains of Port Royal's shoreline in 1695, 3 years after the earthquake. Much of the city is still underwater, visible beneath the clear Caribbean waters, streets and buildings preserved in the depths. The surviving portions of the city are being slowly abandoned as people move to Kingston. You can see, if you look carefully into the water, the ruins of what was once the Jewish quarter. A foundation here, a collapsed wall there. Somewhere down there are the remains of the synagogue, its Torah, scrolls long since dissolved by salt water, its sand floor mixed with the sediment of the harbour bottom. On land, a few buildings remain standing, damaged but not destroyed. They house the remaining residents, those too poor to leave or too stubborn to abandon their homes. The taverns are mostly closed. The warehouses are empty. The ships in the harbour are few and belong to merchants conducting legitimate trade, not privateers returning from raids. An old Jewish man named Moses walks slowly along the waterfront. He is one of the survivors, one of the few Jews who remained in Port Royal after the earthquake. He lost his wife in the disaster, lost his home and warehouse, lost nearly everything he had accumulated over 30 years in Jamaica. He walks to the water's edge and looks down into the clear depths. He can see a street corner he recognizes, a building where he once attended a wedding. It is perhaps 15 feet underwater, preserved perfectly in the absence of air and light. Fish swim through what were once rooms where people lived and loved and died. Moses says Kaddish, the prayer for the dead. He recites it in Hebrew, his voice soft and tired. He is saying it for his wife, for the friends and community members who died, for the Port Royal that was and will never be again. The words are ancient, have been said by countless Jews at countless graves across millennia. They connect him to that long chain of mourning and remembrance. When he finishes, he turns away from the water. He will leave Port Royal soon, will go to Kingston, where his son has established a small shop. He will live out his remaining years quietly, will tell his grandchildren stories about the old days, about Port Royal before the earthquake, about the ships and the privateers and the wild wealth that flowed through the city. But he will not tell them everything. He will not mention the moral compromises, the blind eyes turned to obvious crimes, the wealth built on theft and violence. Those memories he will keep to himself, will take with him to the grave. Better that the next generation remember Port Royal as it should have been rather than as it was. The sun is setting now, the same sun that set on Port Royal's glory and sets now on its ruins. The light fades from gold to orange to purple. The stars begin to appear, the same stars that guided ships across the Caribbean, that witnessed everything and remember nothing. What happened to the Jewish pirates and their descendants? How did this history fade from memory, and what traces did it leave behind? Many of the families enriched by privateering gradually transformed themselves into respectable merchants over the course of the 18th century. The transition was often seamless. A man who had invested in privateering expeditions in his youth might, as he aged, focus exclusively on legitimate trade. His sons, raised in relative prosperity, might never engage in anything more adventurous than negotiating cargo prices or managing warehouses. Within 2 or 3 generations, the origins of family wealth became obscure. A prosperous merchant family in Curaçao or Jamaica in the 1750s might owe its fortune to prizes taken in the 1660s, but that connection would be forgotten or deliberately obscured. Respectability required amnesia. The past was quietly buried, and no one asked uncomfortable questions about how grandfather had made his initial stake. Some families maintained their Jewish identity throughout these transformations. The Sephardic communities of Curaçao, Jamaica, Barbados, and other Caribbean islands continued into the 18th and 19th centuries, maintaining synagogues, observing traditions, marrying within the community. But they became increasingly bourgeois, increasingly respectable. The wild days of Port Royal and the privateering era became embarrassing memories, stories not shared with outsiders. Other families assimilated partially or completely. A son might marry a Christian woman and convert. A daughter might be drawn to the dominant culture and leave Judaism behind. Over generations, Jewish identity could dissolve, leaving only a family name of Portuguese or Spanish origin as a hint of Sephardic ancestry. The descendants of Jewish pirates might become Anglican plantation owners, with no memory of their ancestors' faith or adventures. The communities themselves changed character. The Curaçao Jewish community, which had been closely tied to maritime commerce and privateering in the 1600s, became more focused on plantation agriculture and traditional merchant activities in the 1700s. The synagogue remained, the traditions continued, but the connection to the sea and to the rougher aspects of Caribbean life gradually attenuated. In Amsterdam, which had been the metropolitan center of Sephardic Jewish life and the financial backing for many Caribbean ventures, the community also evolved. The Portuguese Jews of Amsterdam became wealthy and influential, building magnificent synagogues and producing scholars and poets, but they too wanted to forget the more questionable aspects of their commercial empire. The involvement in privateering, the profits from prizes, the moral compromises of Caribbean commerce, these were not topics for polite discussion. Written records of Jewish privateering activities became scarce. Official documents existed, Admiralty court records, ships' rosters, account ledgers, but these were bureaucratic materials, not histories. They recorded transactions and legal proceedings without providing context or narrative. And many of these records were eventually lost, destroyed in fires, discarded as no longer relevant, or simply decayed from neglect and tropical climate. The Jewish communities themselves did not preserve these stories. Unlike tales of scholars and rabbis, which were carefully transmitted through generations, stories of pirates and privateers were not considered appropriate for preservation. They did not fit the self-image that Jewish communities wanted to cultivate. Judaism emphasized learning, righteousness, adherence to law. Pirates, even Jewish pirates with understandable motivations, did not exemplify these ideals. Moreover, as the memory of the Inquisition and expulsion became more distant, the emotional context that had made privateering seem justified also faded. By the late 1700s, Jews living in the Caribbean had never experienced persecution directly. The Inquisition was something their great-great-grandparents had fled, a historical abstraction rather than a living trauma. Without that emotional context, the actions of the early privateers became harder to understand or justify. The folklore that had developed, stories like the Shield of Abraham and Rabbi Chaim ibn Ezra's Golem, persisted longer than historical memory. These tales were entertaining, served educational purposes in teaching children about courage and faith, and were sufficiently mythologized that no one worried about their moral implications. But even these stories gradually faded as communities evolved and older oral traditions were displaced by new concerns. By the early 19th century, the era of Jewish pirates was essentially forgotten. The Caribbean itself had changed dramatically. The heyday of sugar plantations was passing. Slavery, which had been the foundation of the Caribbean economy, was increasingly questioned and would be abolished in British colonies in 1833. The region's strategic importance was declining as global trade patterns shifted. the Jewish communities remained but were much reduced. Many families had emigrated to England, to the Netherlands, to North America, seeking better opportunities. Those who stayed were often isolated, small communities maintaining traditions but increasingly disconnected from broader Jewish life. The grand dreams of the 17th century, when the Caribbean seemed full of possibility, had been replaced by quieter, more modest realities. Some traces remained in family traditions and names. A family might know that their ancestors had come from Amsterdam to Curaçao in the 1600s, that they had been merchants, that they had prospered. But the details, how exactly that prosperity was achieved, what connections to privateering existed, what moral compromises were made, these specifics were lost. The past became a collection of names and dates, genealogy without narrative. The synagogues themselves served as physical monuments to this history. The Mikveh Israel Emmanuel Synagogue in Curaçao, built in 1732 on the site of the earlier 1651 structure, stood as a testament to the continuity of Jewish life in the Caribbean. Its sand floor, its Portuguese inscriptions, its architecture all connected present to past. But even there, the specific stories of how the community had been founded, of the privateers and merchants who had made it possible, were not prominently featured. Visitors to these synagogues in the 1800s would have learned about Sephardic traditions, about the escape from the Inquisition, about the establishment of Jewish communities in the New World. But they would have heard little about privateering, about the moral complexities of Caribbean commerce, about the violence that had been part of this history. The story was sanitized, made respectable, fit for polite company. The non-Jewish world, meanwhile, maintained its own memories of Caribbean piracy, but these were not focused on Jews. Henry Morgan became a legendary figure, celebrated in England as a hero despite his brutal methods. Other pirates like Blackbeard and Captain Kidd entered popular mythology. These stories emphasized the exotic and adventurous aspects of piracy, while often ignoring or minimizing its brutality and its connections to colonialism and slavery. Jewish participation in this world was either forgotten or relegated to footnotes. The occasional mention might appear in a historical account, a reference to Jewish merchants in Port Royal, a note about Moses Cohen Henriques' role in the 1628 capture of the Spanish treasure fleet. But these mentions were brief and disconnected, never coalescing into a coherent narrative. Part of this erasure was deliberate. Jewish communities in Europe and the Americas were struggling for acceptance and equal rights throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. They emphasized their contributions to culture, commerce, and society, while downplaying anything that might feed anti-Jewish prejudice. Pirates, even pirates from 2 centuries earlier, were not helpful to this cause. Anti-Jewish writers occasionally mentioned Jewish involvement in piracy as evidence of Jewish criminality or moral deficiency. These references were typically exaggerated, distorted, or simply invented, but they were dangerous enough that Jewish communities preferred not to draw attention to the subject. Silence seemed safer than attempting to provide context or explanation. The historical profession, meanwhile, was developing its methodologies and focusing on different subjects. In the 19th century, historians were primarily interested in great men, wars, and political developments. The minutiae of Caribbean commerce, the activities of minor privateers, the economic networks of merchant communities, these were not considered proper subjects for historical study. Even when historians did examine Caribbean history, they typically focused on plantation agriculture, slave rebellions, and imperial rivalries, not on the Jewish communities that had played supporting roles in these larger dramas. Documentation that did exist often remained in archives, unexamined. Admiralty court records, correspondence between merchants, ships' rosters, account ledgers. These materials existed in Amsterdam, London, Kingston, and other repositories, but without researchers seeking them out, they simply accumulated dust. The stories they could tell remained locked within them, waiting for later generations to discover. Imagine an archive room in Amsterdam in the year 1850. It is a large, high-ceilinged space lined with wooden shelves that reach from floor to ceiling. On these shelves are thousands of volumes, bound collections of documents, ledgers, correspondence files, legal records. They are organized by date and subject, but the organization system is arcane, known only to the archive's keepers. In one corner, covered with a century and a half of dust, sits a collection of West India Company records from the 1620s and 1630s. Among these documents are reports from ship's captains, including mentions of Moses, Cohen, Henriques, and other Jewish officers and crew members. There are records of prize adjudications, showing Jewish merchants purchasing captured Spanish goods. There are letters discussing the logistics of privateering operations. An archivist walks past these shelves occasionally, perhaps retrieving a document for a researcher interested in Dutch colonial administration or maritime law. But no one is specifically looking for information about Jewish pirates. No one yet understands that this material, properly examined and contextualized, could reveal an entire forgotten chapter of Jewish history. The documents wait silently. The names recorded in them, Henriques, Palache, Abrabanel, dozens of others, mean nothing to the archivist. They are just names in old records, Portuguese-sounding surnames mixed with Hebrew given names, notations in fading ink on yellowing paper. The stories these names could tell, the lives they represent, remain trapped in the past, inaccessible without someone to ask the right questions and do the patient work of reconstruction. Outside the archive, Amsterdam continues its bustling life. The city's Jewish community remains significant, though changed from what it was in the 17th century. Portuguese Jews have been joined by Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe. The community is prosperous, integrated into Dutch society while maintaining distinct identity. But their history, particularly the Caribbean chapter, is not widely known even among themselves. In the Caribbean, in Curaçao's Jewish quarter, similar forgetting is occurring. Old people who remember hearing stories from their grandparents are dying, taking their memories with them. The younger generation is focused on present concerns, on making livings and raising families. The past is past and seems increasingly irrelevant. The synagogue stands, solid and permanent seeming. Services continue, traditions are maintained. But the living connection to the founding generation is being severed, strand by strand. Soon, no one will remember firsthand what the pioneers were like, what they did, why they did it. The story will exist only in fragmentary written records, and those records will not be examined for many years to come. This is how history gets lost, not through dramatic destruction, but through gradual neglect, through the accumulation of years and the failure to pass stories from one generation to the next. Each individual act of forgetting is small, barely noticeable, but they accumulate, and eventually an entire era can disappear from memory, leaving only the faintest traces. The ocean, meanwhile, continues its work of erasure. The wrecks of ships that once carried Jewish sailors lie on the seafloor, gradually disintegrating. Wood becomes food for marine organisms, metal corrodes. Even the most durable artifacts, cannons, anchors, coins, become encrusted with coral and sediment, transformed into part of the reef ecosystem. In a few more centuries, they will be unrecognizable, impossible to distinguish from natural formations. Port Royal, that legendary city, rests beneath the waves. Occasionally, storms shift the sediment, revealing streets and buildings before covering them again. The ruins are there, preserved by the anaerobic conditions of the harbour bottom, But they are also constantly changing, slowly dissolving, gradually becoming part of the geological rather than historical record. The people, the Jewish pirates and merchants, their families, their associates, have long since returned to the elements. Their bodies dissolved in tropical soil or were scattered in the ocean. Their bones, if any remain, are fragments mixed with earth and sand. They have become quite literally part of the landscape they once inhabited. And yet, paradoxically, they are not entirely gone. Something persists. The genes they carried forward continue in their descendants, scattered across the world. The institutions they built, some of the synagogues, some of the commercial firms, endure in modified forms. The precedents they set, the networks they established, the cultural patterns they created, these have echoes even if the original source is forgotten. Memory is not only conscious recall, it is also embedded in culture, in practices, in the ways communities organize themselves and understand their place in the world. The Jewish communities of the Caribbean, even as they forgot the specific stories of privateering, retained something of the spirit that had animated those early pioneers: adaptability, pragmatism, the ability to operate across cultural boundaries, a certain independence of spirit. This unconscious inheritance is harder to trace than written records or oral traditions, but it is perhaps more durable. It is carried forward not through deliberate teaching, but through example and imitation, through the subtle ways that parents shape children, that communities influence members, that the past imposes itself on the present even when not explicitly remembered. Let this image rest with you now. Archives full of unexamined documents, synagogues standing as monuments to forgotten stories, ocean floors covered with the debris of vanished lives, all of it slowly changing, gradually transforming, participating in the great cycles of preservation and decay that govern everything. The Jewish pirates sailed into history and then sailed out of it, remembered and then forgotten, and perhaps now, in these words, remembered again, however briefly. But even this remembering will fade as you slip into sleep, will become part of dreams, or perhaps not even that, just the formless rest that follows all stories, all memories, all attempts to hold on to what is already gone. We are nearing the end of our journey through this forgotten history. The stories have been told, the details laid out, the complexities acknowledged. Now, as sleep draws close, let us return to where we began. The ocean itself. The Caribbean Sea, which was the stage for all these dramas, remains. It is the same body of water that Spanish treasure ships crossed, that privateers prowled, that refugees sailed seeking sanctuary. The same currents flow, the same trade winds blow, the same sun rises and sets over the same horizon. But the ocean remembers nothing. It is indifferent to human stories, to our ambitions and fears, to our cruelties and our courage. Ships that once ruled these waters are now coral-encrusted wrecks on the ocean floor, or have dissolved entirely into sediment and rust. The men who sailed them are dust. Their names are forgotten or barely remembered. This erasure is both tragic and liberating. Tragic because so much was lost, stories that will never be recovered, experiences that dissolved with the bodies that held them, truths buried beneath the waves. But liberating because it reminds us that all human drama is temporary, that our current concerns, however urgent they feel, will also pass into the ocean of time and be forgotten. The Jewish pirates sought many things. They sought wealth, and some found it, though it rarely lasted beyond a generation or two. They sought revenge, and some achieved it, attacking Spanish ships and settlements, making their enemies feel fear. They sought freedom, and they found a kind of freedom on the open sea, far from the constraints of European society. But what they could not achieve was permanence. They could not create something that would endure unchanged across centuries. Their synagogues crumbled or were destroyed. Their wealth was spent or lost. Their names faded from memory. Even their bones, whether buried in forgotten cemeteries or consigned to the ocean depths, have long since returned to the elements. This is true for all of us, of course. None of us will create anything truly permanent. Even great monuments erode. Even powerful empires fall. Even the most carefully preserved records will eventually be lost or become incomprehensible to future readers. We are all temporary, all headed toward the same dissolution. But if permanence is impossible, meaning is not. The Jewish pirates lived lives that had meaning to them and to those around them. They made choices that mattered, took actions that had consequences, shaped their small corners of the world. The fact that their influence did not last forever does not negate the reality of their existence or the significance of their choices. For those of us hearing their stories now, across the gulf of centuries, they offer lessons and warnings. They remind us that persecuted people sometimes become persecutors, that victims can become victors, that moral clarity is difficult when survival is at stake. They show us that resistance is possible but comes with costs, that freedom can be found in unexpected places, that home is sometimes not a place but a feeling of being untethered. Most fundamentally, they remind us that Jewish history is larger and stranger than we often imagine. It includes not just scholars and merchants, not just victims and martyrs, but also warriors and pirates, traders and spies, people who move between worlds and identities with remarkable fluidity. To know this history is to understand that Jews have always been more diverse, more adaptable, more surprising than any single narrative can capture. The ocean holds their secrets still. Somewhere beneath the Caribbean waters, perhaps, there rest the remains of a ship that was once commanded by a Jewish captain. The wood has long since rotted away, the ropes dissolved, the sails disintegrated, but the cannons might remain, and the anchors, and the silver coins that spilled from a chest when the ship went down. Divers will never find these remains, never connect them to their specific history. The ocean has mixed them with countless other wrecks, has scattered them across the seafloor, has buried them in sediment. The ship's name is lost, the captain's name is forgotten. The stories the crew told around their evening fires have evaporated like morning mist. But for a moment, in our imagination, we can see that ship. We can watch it sail, sails full of wind, cutting through blue water under a brilliant sun. We can see the crew at work, men of different backgrounds and faiths, united in common purpose. We can see the captain at the helm, a Jewish man who fled persecution, who found freedom on the water, who lived by his wits and his courage. The ship sails toward the horizon. The sun is setting, painting the sky in impossible colors, orange and pink and purple, colors that seem too vivid to be real but are precisely real, are exactly what the Caribbean sky looks like when the sun goes down. The ship becomes a silhouette, then a dark speck, then invisible as it merges with the darkening horizon. And then it is gone, sailed into the space between memory and dream, between history and myth. It joins all the other ships that have sailed these waters, all the other stories that have been told and forgotten, all the other lives that blazed briefly and then went dark. The ocean of sleep is rising around you, warm and welcoming. You can let go now. You can stop trying to follow the story, stop trying to remember details. None of it matters. All that matters is this: you are safe, you are comfortable, you are allowed to rest. The Jewish pirates have sailed away into history. The Caribbean of the 1600s has faded into the past. The synagogues and taverns, the treasure ships and naval battles, the moral complexities and adventures, all of it recedes like the tide pulling back from shore. What remains is simply this: the gentle rocking sensation of a ship at anchor, the sound of water lapping against a hull, the feeling of being held by something larger than yourself. The ocean, indifferent and eternal, carries you gently towards sleep.
And so we end where all stories end, in silence and darkness, in the peaceful nothing that follows all the sound and fury of living. The Jewish pirates of the Caribbean lived and died. Their stories, forgotten for centuries, have been told once more. And now, even these telling words fade into the background, becoming just another sound among sounds, no more significant than the wind or the waves. You have traveled far tonight across centuries and oceans, through stories of courage and cruelty, freedom and bondage, resistance and compromise. You have met people long dead, walked streets long sunken, stood on decks of ships that rotted away 300 years ago. It has been a journey, and now the journey is ending. But ending does not mean ceasing. The ocean continues. The stars continue their wheeling dance. The earth turns on its axis, bringing night to those who need rest, and day to those who need light. Everything continues in cycles so vast and ancient that human history is barely a ripple on their surface. You are part of these cycles. Your breathing is part of the breath of the world. Your heartbeat echoes the tides. Your consciousness, flickering now at the edge of sleep, is part of the vast consciousness that permeates all things, that flows through ocean and air, through stone and flesh, through past and present and future. The Jewish pirates understood this in their way. When they stood at the helm of their ships in the vast darkness of a Caribbean night, when they saw the stars reflected in black water and could not tell where ocean ended and sky began, they felt it. The dissolution of boundaries, the merging of self into something infinite.
They are with you now, those long-dead sailors, not as ghosts, but as memories, not as presences, but as stories. They have been your companions on this night voyage, your guides through the channels of history, and now they fade, return to wherever stories go when they are not being told. The sails are furled, the anchor is dropped, the watch is set. The crew sleeps in their hammocks, rocked by gentle swells. The ocean whispers its eternal secrets to those who cannot hear. The stars look down on sleepers and waking alike, indifferent and beautiful. The story is over. The night is deep. The ocean is calm. Everything is as it should be. If this journey through forgotten history has helped you find peace tonight, if these tales of Jewish pirates and Caribbean seas have carried you gently toward rest, I hope you'll return tomorrow night and the night after that. This channel exists to bring you stories from the shadows of history, the chapters that textbooks overlooked, the voices that time tried to silence, the adventures that were too complex, too morally ambiguous, or simply too strange to fit into conventional narratives. Every story is carefully researched from historical sources and academic texts, then woven together. If you found value in tonight's story, please consider subscribing. Press that notification bell so you'll know when the next journey is ready. Each story brings a new chapter from Jewish history's forgotten corners, mystical rabbis and hidden texts, lost communities and ancient mysteries, all designed to accompany you into peaceful sleep. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from tonight. Are you in New York or London, Tel Aviv or Buenos Aires? Knowing that these stories travel across time zones and oceans, connecting people in their quiet moments, makes this work meaningful. Your support allows me to spend time researching each topic to ensure that every story maintains both historical integrity and the gentle, sleep-inducing quality you need. The Library of Whispers remains open, waiting for your return.